30 years ago, on March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker struck a reef in Alaska's Prince William Sound and spilled close to 11 million gallons of crude oil. About 2 weeks later, the Senate Commerce Committee heard from Exxon's chairman, as well as the head of the Coast Guard, who led the government response. Senator Fritz Hollings from South Carolina was chairman. You'll also see questions from committee members Ted Stevens of Alaska and Massachusetts Senator John Kerry. This portion of the hearing is a little over 2 hours.
You ready for me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Rawl, we have your statement. It will be included in the record in its entirety, and under the circumstances, you can deliver it in its entirety if you wish, or summarize, either way.
I'll just sort of summarize it. I'm here to provide a frank response to questions regarding the Exxon Valdez oil spill and to describe our continuing efforts to deal with its consequences. Before I do this, however, I want to express sincere regret as to what happened on behalf of all the employees of Exxon and certainly on behalf of myself. I really can't tell you how sorry we are this disaster occurred. And we are particularly sympathetic to the impacts on the residents of Alaska and particularly those in the Prince William Sound area. That's where the difficulty is really creating a great deal of problems for those people. As has been said many times this morning and by us earlier than this, we take full responsibility, and we've done so from the beginning. And we'll continue doing all we can to clean up and mitigate the spill's effects, and all necessary resources are being fully employed. It has already been mentioned by Secretary Skinner that the environment in the area and the remoteness and the high tides and the physical problems associated with it make it a particularly difficult problem. A few comments about the spill, just to put it again in perspective. It's been mentioned many times. The spill has been an estimated 240,000 barrels that occurred early on March 24. We have other factual information. The weather was clear. The ship had no known mechanical difficulties. A course change was requested and authorized because of ice in the outgoing channel. The captain subsequently left the bridge, and tests made sometime after the grounding showed the captain's alcohol level was above the limits established by the Coast Guard. That's clear. There are still many unanswered questions as to what occurred during this period of time. We're conducting, of course, not one but many investigations within the company, as are the National Transportation Safety Board and the Coast Guard. There are other federal, state investigations and all that are also underway, and we're participating in all of those. The oil spill contingency plan was activated immediately. It called for a two-phase response. The first phase was the responsibility of Alaska. The second phase was our responsibility as the shipper. And our response was immediate. We immediately established the priorities. First priority was to prevent additional spills from the damaged tanker, which had approximately 1 million barrels of North Slope crude on it, and certainly trying to immediately mitigate the impact of the spill on the environment and the people of Alaska. A major mobilization began immediately, and by now involves, as the Secretary said, many hundreds of people, 1,000 people, a lot of boats, planes, helicopters, and so forth. I won't go into all those details with you. Currently, we're receiving support from a large number of organizations. We have a large number of experts, academics, and so forth under contract, and we have 200 Exxon experts and other consultants that are attempting to manage our part of this. We are mobilized to mitigate the economic impact on the communities of Prince William Sound. A claims office was staffed by 30 people. It's open, and adequate funds are placed in accounts in local banks. Those funds are available to provide immediate advance payments to those requiring monetary support while claims are being prepared, reviewed, and processed. And I've insisted that that be done as expeditiously as possible. Our intention is to provide fair, reasonable, and prompt settlements. As of noon Tuesday, we had the remaining oil that could be removed from the tanker while it was on a reef. We had that off the reef. We had it all out of the ship. As I'm sure most of you read in this morning's paper, the ship was successfully refloated, and it's now in an area on next to Naked Island, where we will do temporary repairs, and when that's completed, we'll take the ship into dry dock somewhere and repair it permanently. A couple more comments. For now, it's too early to assess the long-term environmental damage. Natural resource damage assessment studies are underway, and that's been mentioned. A number of them are being made with the EPA and others, NOAA, and we've also having a number done ourselves. We cannot judge how long recovery will take in Prince William Sound, but I can assure you that since March 24th, the accident has been receiving our full attention and will continue to do so until the job is done. We're continuing to cooperate fully to establish the facts as to what happened. More importantly, however, we want to help in any way we can to establish what might be done to reduce the chances of such an incident happening again. I can assure you that actions are already underway within Exxon to revise policies and procedures in the light of this accident and to preclude what happened from happening again, unless there's a different set of circumstances.
Exactly on that point, did it not happen again? Has Exxon learned, Mr. Rawl, not to risk such a valuable cargo in an immense vessel, the length of 3 football fields, which takes a couple of miles or so to even turn course, to risk that to just one pilot and not have a co-pilot? I mean, is that this right now? If I went out on, let's say, 3 or 4 other Exxon super tankers this morning, would I find only one pilot, master pilot, licensed and capable
No, sir.
of steerage?
The Prince William Sound areas is unusual. That most of the 3 mates plus the captain is licensed to pilot this ship in many areas. In Prince William Sound, as has been said many times this morning, you have the state pilot takes it to a certain point, and then can you hear me? I'm not.
I know it goes in and out.
Excuse me.
We've tried to correct it all morning. Yes,
well, I'll
sir.
try to talk a little louder.
Please do.
My
Yes, sir.
voice holds up. But in this case, the pilot was also the captain. Obviously, we had no knowledge of how he was impaired. I think it's possible, however, or as I understand the law there, it's possible to have 2 mates on the bridge at the same time in a case like this, to where you could, in fact, do what needs to be done when you have ice in one channel, and there was a great deal of concern about the ice and so forth. I'm not trying to make any excuses on this, but the facts are there are ways to do that if, in fact, as you suggested in earlier conversation with Secretary Skinner, that if one had a heart attack or something, it just seemed kind of ridiculous. So there were other options available. Now, the same impairment, apparently, that created the spill to begin with, created a situation where maybe the master could have said, bring another mate up, and they're actually, when the skipper was on the bridge, there were 4 people. There was a lookout on one of the wings. There was a person that was in charge, which then was the captain. There was a 3rd mate who was his shift, and there were also the man that was steering the vessel, or the person steering the vessel. So that was the situation. When he went down, as I understood it, he could have sent up another mate and been legally responsive. Whether or not that ship would have hit the reef or not, I would expect it would have had a much better chance of getting through there. I've had a lot of difficulty understanding this accident myself, I can assure you that.
Well, I think that's the first lesson we've learned this morning about the co-pilot. They're thoroughly equipped, because the first and the second mate weren't the qualified masters of vessels, as is required in those waters, as the record shows. Now, you said, of course, you didn't have any knowledge, and yet they'll say in the law, knew or should have known. Isn't it the case that the record shows that this particular master the vessel, had 3 convictions of driving under the influence of alcohol. In other words, he had an alcohol problem.
Yes, sir. It shows that.
And that doesn't mean, man, that'd scare me to death in a boardroom if I were there on Exxon's board.
Well, it
and you
scared
told
me
me that the fellow had 3 convictions running out with that expensive cargo and magnificent vessel was only 3 years old. I'd say, look, I mean, we're not that short of masters. We're grinding them up at Kings Bay, or Kings Point, I should say, up there at the Chrysler Estate in Long Island. We give you all the masters you want.
Yes.
I mean, how do you got no explanation for that?
No, sir. Obviously,
well, I'm not going to try to press that point. The third
well, let me just tell you, we have some things in place, and it came up a little bit earlier regarding random testing for drugs and alcohol and the difficulties that you have in some cases negotiating those. But we can impose that in certain instances, and we've imposed it. Not before the spill, but we've got it in the policy. And we're going to do it. If we get lawsuits on it, we're going to take the lawsuits on it. I would have felt a lot better had we taken a lawsuit in this kind of a thing and then said, well, we went to court and we lost it, rather than the situation we find ourselves in now. Now, that, Senator, there's more to this alcohol question than you're probably aware of it. Let me clarify a little further. We didn't know about the DWIs. And of course, I never heard this man until 2 weeks ago. So obviously,
right.
I'm not looking for any sympathy, by the way. But we did know he came in, as I understand it, and said, I have an alcohol problem a number of years ago. He was rehabilitated. That was consistent with an alcohol policy. However, the judgment to put him back on a ship is a judgment made at an operating level. Obviously, it was a bad judgment. Could have been a bad judgment in a lot of people's eyes on a going-in basis, mine being one of them. But in any event, I just wanted to make that clear in case you hadn't heard of that. I didn't want you feeling like I didn't level with you when I was up here talking to you.
I appreciate that. The third mate, now, you find no culpability there, I take it, because while you fired the master, you now have corporate counsel representing the third mate. Is that right?
Well, what we found, well, you find yourself in this kind of a situation, and I'm not too expert in these answers, but I've asked these same questions. In the case of the captain, initially, we told him to get his own counsel. This was before we knew that the alcohol situation would show up, and by the way, those tests didn't show up, as you may recall, until several days later. But we knew that when the ship went aground and he wasn't on the beach, we obviously had a conflict between the corporate interest and probably between the corporate interest and the individual's interest. So we said, you get your own counsel, we'll pay for that. When we found out, however, there was alcohol involved and the other circumstances, we found out he violated a lot of policies, he was terminated. Now, in the case of the third mate, it's sort of in that same phase. There has been, to my knowledge, no testimony taken under oath in this case yet, because the National Transportation Safety Board is still developing the hearing time and so forth. But everyone's been interviewed by those individuals, by the Coast Guard, by Exxon and so forth. But we have to let this thing get into that venue, I think.
On the response, you said that the first phase response, first was for Alaska, and the second in line was for you, Exxon, and you responded immediately, inferring that perhaps it wasn't a prompt or an immediate response by Alaska. What is your position on that?
Well, I'm sure you've heard this before, but there are a number of oil spill contingency plans that are involved in this situation. One of them was the Alaska oil spill contingency plan, which, by the way, the first one had to be in place before the pipeline started up, and that was in 1977 or 76 that this plan was in place. It's been revised several times since. Then the shippers were separated out of the pipeline, and they had to have a spill contingency plan, and that circa early 80s, I'm not real sure, I think it's 82. When I said the The first part was Alyeska. It's a relatively, the spill envisioned for Alyeska per se in phase 1 is a relatively small spill. I think the numbers were mentioned this morning. There has always been recognition that if you had a tanker spill in Prince William Sound, and you mentioned the probable case, nobody ever thought it was probable that a spill would be this large, but there has been a rather modest write-up in the contingency plan for that recognized the possibility of a 200,000 barrel spill, which is in the same ballpark as what we're talking about here. There are certain times as to when you mobilize resources from other ports and around the world, and we in our case, we're bringing them from Europe, Florida, and other places. Now, an important part of that contingency plan, anything that large, required and in effect had approved by the federal agencies, the EPA, and the state of Alaska agencies involved, recognized that you had to promptly disperse a dispersant. In this case, Corexit 9527 would have been the proper dispersant. That mobilization started on that on Friday. A team left Houston, a management team, the president of the Exxon shipping company, the man mentioned earlier today, Mr. Rossi, was sent with a number of associates. We have response teams on the West Coast and the Gulf East Coast, and we also have not only current employees, but anyone that's been in our research effort in these regards in recent years and wants to do it. We put them under contract and we call them. All these people convened. The management team was there later on the day on Friday. We had a C-130 available for spraying, and we had a large amount of Corexit 9527 there on Saturday. And then we had some delays that occurred and some problems occurred, not because the plan didn't provide how the decisions would be made, but because the plan provided for a number of people to be involved in the decision-making process.
Senator Stevens, I've got a lot of other questions, but I want to yield to you.
Very well, thank you very much. Mr. Rawl, I know what you say. You didn't know this captain personally, and we certainly don't imply anything personal in our feelings, but my problem dealing with this now is the problem of the multiplicity of plans. It's my understanding that Alaska did have a contingency plan. There's a regional response team plan. There was a Prince William Sound company plan. Would you do us the favor of asking your people to give us a copy of each one of those since the beginning of the pipeline shipments out of Valdez? I believe you have, and you'll have to get them anyway for the lawsuit. I think this committee ought to have those series.
We'll do that. You want them, each member of the committee, just send them to the council, I guess.
Now let me tell you, and I'm pleased to tell the committee, Bill Stevens is a friend of mine. As a matter of fact, I think distantly we're related. We talked about that one night. He is the president of your tanker company. He came to Alaska and made a statement saying that Exxon would accept the total responsibility for this. You have made a similar statement here now. But after Mr. Stevens left Alaska, your legal department indicated that as far as the liability to the customers in terms of failure to delivery, that Exxon was going to rely on an act of God theory. Is that correct?
When Mr. Stevens made his statement, and by the way, Senator, as you probably know, he's the president of Exxon USA, which is our principal operating affiliate in this country. They're talking about the impact of the spill in Alaska, because you start getting into something downstream of that in terms of, I assume you talk about customers and things of this sort of nature. You can roll that on around the world, and there's just no end to it.
No, I just want you to know it was interpreted in Alaska as being a second thought of Exxon, and it left a significant doubt in the minds of Alaskans as to the extent that the Exxon major national company was going to accept the statement of liability that Mr. Stevens made.
Oh,
And many of us are lawyers. You're the president of the company, but your lawyers are liable to go to court and say, after all, that was not a legal obligation. That was a statement of policy, and we're now defending against these suits. What is the policy of Exxon with regard to any expense that develops as a result of this spill?
Well, obviously, I've said again here this morning, it's our intention to stay after this spill, clean it up to the best of scientific policy, best that we can do, and also to pay those people in your state that have been damaged by this spill. And there are a variety of kinds of damages. Now, when you talk about suits, we've got suits, as I'm sure you're aware. You're all a lot of lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, but the facts are there are a lot of these suits that are legitimate suits, and hopefully none of the people in Alaska that will be damaged will have to go to court.
As I share that problem about the necessity for these people to live in towns. As a matter of fact, very few of them have real active courts for us to pursue their rights. And I'm hopeful that the system will be put in place by the President for an emergency declaration, I hope, because that would put the SBA and the Federal Emergency Management Agency and others out there to give temporary assistance, which, if there are claims that can be presented that your company will pay, the people that they get that assistance can repay it. But meanwhile, there are a lot of people, as in the earthquake, people that weren't even in the area of the earthquake had severe financial losses as a result of it. Now, that's going on right now, not only in my state, but I think some of it's going down into Seattle. And we have to have some temporary assistance. That's not your problem. But I just want to make sure that from the point of view of the company, that act of God defense that was raised with regard to the deliveries of the oil to customers has no relationship to the events that took place in my state.
None.
Now I have a map here that I made when I was up there. I mean, I didn't make the map, but we drew these things on there. It shows the 4 hatchery areas. That was the Exxon Valdez on Bly Reef. It was my understanding that the obligation to have a pilot on board basically came down to about this line, and that the third mate was qualified to handle the ship through Henshapook entrance, but he was not qualified to pilot this vessel above that line. It's also my understanding that the captain was the only person on board after the pilot got off as the ship came through the Valdez Narrows. The captain was the only person on board that was qualified to run the ship. Is that your understanding?
My understanding is that the captain was the only man on board licensed as a pilot to run the ship.
That's right.
Now, that's different in my view as to who was qualified or unqualified, but
well, it's my understanding that third mate was not qualified to run that ship past Bly Reef.
Well, Senator,
I'm not trying to pin you down
the thread here. Frankly, I can't. I'm having a little trouble even seeing a map, but I know where Blythe Reef is and so forth, where the channel goes.
Well, unfortunately, it's Bly Reef, like Captain Bly. You know, that
is
my understanding that it came down. The captain was required to get it past Bly Island and Bly Reef, and he did not do that. Now, we've just learned this morning, as a result of disclosure yesterday, that the computer on this vessel was programmed by the captain as the pilot left, and the tug left it, and that the third officer attempted to countermand the computer program, and it was actually the computer that drove that vessel on the reef. Is that your understanding?
No, sir, it is not. My understanding, and this is as a result of interviews made with the third officer, that he turned that computer off, and that it was not at the time he hit the rocks on automatic pilot. But, you know, I'm just telling you what he has said, what he's testified to.
All right. Again, I've taken too much time here this morning. It's my understanding from the visits in Cordova that the Cordova people who built those hatcheries, those are not federal, they were built by the people in the Cordova area to enhance the production of salmon in the area, that they felt compelled and did go and acquire the boom and started the protection of those hatcheries because the Exxon group would not move to, in their opinion, quickly enough to start the protection. Now, that is the basis, I think, of the feeling in the Prince William Sound now that there should have been federalization. Have you talked to your people as to why some of the offers of assistance that were made were refused? For instance, the interdepartmental team headed by the Bureau of Land Management, federal and state team, went to Valdez, stayed there 2 days. It was rejected. It's a crisis management team financed by the taxpayers. It did work out a contingency plan in Seward to protect the Resurrection Bay and the Kenai Fjords National Park. Secondly, I'm told that the Soviets came in and made an offer, the Norwegians made an offer, the Swedes made an offer. We've had a series of offers from responsible entities that have dealt with oil spills in the past, and your coordinator refused the assistance. Now, is that a company policy? And were you informed of that?
First, it's not a company policy. Second, a lot of those things that have alleged to have been said up there, it's my understanding, for example, we're willing to accept the Russian offer.
Is that ship going to be allowed in there to help now?
I don't think we would have been able to keep it out anyway, but certainly we've asked to have it. We're accepting all the help and have been trying to accept all the help. The Norwegian offer that had allegedly been made early in this spill was really, they wanted to have, as I understand it, Senator, and the number of people may be wrong, have 4 observers come and look. And as far as I'm concerned, and no, that was approved, but there was no, what I understand, offer of help. There was, you know, if they want observers, they want observers. There was a French offer about observers. I don't know the other ones. Now, in
Germans also contacted me, the Germans.
The Germans. Now, there's a question of offers of help, and then there's a question of a lot of people just want to see how you deal with a large oil spill, and of course, obviously, lots being learned up there. So it's a little bit different. The words are different, and the intent is different, but we're not turned down any offers. Now, in terms of the fishermen out of Cordova, it's my understanding that we're utilizing a lot of those people with their boats, and that we're trying to fully employ them. Now, you know better than most in this room, including me, that we're not dealing with beaches that look like Miami Beach or somewhere else up there. These are very difficult conditions, and that's why it's such a pristine area and why it's so tragic and why it has all the wildlife it has. But we also have concern. We're getting thousands of volunteers from our own people in the U.S. and around the world want to come help. And we're getting thousands of letters and telephone calls from people all over the country saying we want to go and help. But one of the only good things I can say about this thing is that so far no one was killed in this operation, and I'm sure there have been some minor injuries, but as you know, Senator, you have a 15-foot tide in Prince William Sound, which is very unusual in the U.S. anyway. You have to go to your state to find anything like that, except up in Maine, and I guess we may have a senator from Maine, Bay of Fundy or somewhere, has something like that. But when that water goes in and out each day, or if you fall off the beach when the tide's going out, you better be a hell of a good swimmer, or somebody better be there with a boat. So we're talking about a very risky situation. It's been accused that we've been slow in cleaning up the beaches. It's going to be slow cleaning up the beaches. We're not, and the beaches of France that were cleaned up were pretty simple kind of a cleanup compared to what we're facing, but we're going to get it done.
Oh, I'm sorry you can't see this, but let me tell you.
I have a mental.
The oceanographer that I referred to at the University of Alaska has been studying this for his lifetime. He told me that you have to view the Prince William Sound as being roughly capable of producing about 25% more fresh water annually than the Mississippi River. That it comes out of that area and it goes southwestward with what we call the Alaska coastal current. As the water exits the Prince William Sound, is basically fresh water. Most people think they're dealing with saline water. that he has tried to make an input on these plans. He's tried to make an input on the plans now for the recovery from this. I gave his name to the people when I was there on Friday. I begged people on Saturday to talk to him. He sent me another contingency, just a report that I'll be glad to make available to the committee today. The people who had knowledge of what was predictable were not consulted. That has left a great feeling with Alaskans. This man is to us the key man for this area. This incident team, one of the first things they did when they got over to Seward was to contact him for the plans dealing with the Kenai Fjords National Park and Resurrection Bay. I think anybody that's looked at those plans will tell you they're absolutely perfect. They set the priorities. They said how much boom would be necessary in each area. They determined the areas that had the greatest sensitivity. Incidentally, although they were a federal team, their first area was an area under the response to that was the responsibility of the city of Seward. They said that was the #1 salmon producing stream in the area, and it had to be protected first. They gave your people a list of boom that said they had to have. Your people, I've got to say, came forward and said, okay, we'll pay for it, but we can't move it. And we had to scurry around and find people to move that boom to protect over there. But what I'm telling you is, they were over there in Valdez. They were over there on Sunday and Monday and Tuesday.
Sunday.
This is the interdepartmental team.
Yeah.
They were sleeping in an abandoned warehouse, asking each day to be heard, and they were told they were not needed. Now, if you want to know why we feel so strongly that there should have been a federal presence, that's it. Your people said, we don't need you. I was with the National Guard General, an Eskimo, incidentally. We're very proud of him, a general in his own right. He flew me down there. He offered his assistance, and in my presence, they said, we don't need your help. Now, Mr. Rawl, you've got a wonderful company, and it's a pride of our country, I think, that you've been able to do with that company internationally what you've done. But in this instance, we feel you let us down. And I've got to say it, and I'd say it to anybody. Thank you.
Good. Senator Galton.
Senator Stevens asked you, Mr. Rawl, about what he considered to be a backing away from your agreement to assume responsibility when you said you'd treat as an act of God any claims by your customers. Your response to him was that that did not limit your responsibility to Alaskans impacted by this spill. Senator Stevens quite properly pointed out that there are people outside of Alaska who are impacted by this. Many of the fishermen who regularly fish in Prince William Sound are from the state of Washington or from the state of Oregon. Was your answer to him another attempt to limit your liability only to people who are voting residents of Alaska, or does it extend to everyone whose livelihood is impacted by this spill?
Senator, you can understand how sitting here, I presume you're a lawyer, I'm not, but you have to hear the specifics in this. If in fact there's a fisherman in your home state who has been going up to Alaska during the summer and fishing and so forth, and has records to show that, presumably he would be damaged, and I'm sure he has access to counsel, because there's plenty of counsel around who are spend a lot of time looking at this thing. I cannot accept, though, liability ad infinitum, and wherever it goes in the world, the rules of proof and so forth, whatever they mean, have to be taken care of in this regard. We're doing what we can do now. We've been very busy trying to get the ship off the rocks. It's now, thank God, over in a cove where hopefully we can patch it appropriately and we can get it to a dry dock. By the way, the senator from Oregon is not here now, but he made a speech this morning about putting that ship in Oregon and talking about the bar and so forth. And he said that was what Exxon wanted to do. Exxon had a question once, where is there a dry dock on the west coast of the U.S. that could take a ship that size, and it was in Portland, Oregon. that got translated somewhat in the press and so forth, I guess. There are other places in the Far East. I'm not saying where the ship's going, but the governor of Oregon has already, we got communicated through the paper, through the newspaper, a lot of people communicating with. I can't really say that this is what he actually said, because sometimes we get misquoted slightly ourselves, but he's indicated he questions whether he wants it in his state. We didn't even make a decision yet as to where it would go, but I just want to make the record clear on that. I hope I've tried to answer your question, but it's very difficult to me. You're getting me in legal areas that I don't want to get into.
You are not attempting right now to make a distinction and say that your only responsibility will be to affected residents of Alaska.
Right, but when you start talking about customers, I'm sure that...
I wasn't asking about
No,
customers.
but that's the basis that Senator Stevens used and you referred to. That's an entirely different thing.
Okay. I take it that the parent Exxon Corporation some time ago made a decision that it was wise corporate policy for it to own its own shipping line and to ship Alaskan oil in vessels owned by a company or by a subsidiary.
Well, we actually use chartered ships many times also. I don't know how many we're using in Alaskan trade, but in international trade we have some of them. Exxon has 71 ships worldwide. Roughly, maybe off a ship or two, 19 of them in this country. So we do use chartered ships.
But in any event, this ship is owned by a wholly owned subsidiary of the company of which you are CEO. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you give me the chain of command that would go from you as chairman of the parent corporation down through that subsidiary corporation to this captain? Or maybe work it back up. Who is the captain's supervisor and who is his supervisor, so on up to you?
Well, when it gets at the lower levels, I lose the track. But there is a captain has a supervisor, and then that supervisor, presumably, and there may be another supervisor in between also, reports to a manager on the west coast of the U.S. There are also other people who tell this captain what to do in terms of scheduling, and you know, these captains work a few weeks on and a few weeks off, not precise on the time. But then that individual on the west coast who is in port in Benicia, California, which is in San Francisco area, he would report into Houston, where we would have presumably someone we might call an operations manager, and then there's a president of the Exxon Shipping Company who reports to a senior vice president of Exxon USA who reports to the president of that company. We really have management committees at the level of Exxon USA, and we have management committees in New York, and then the president of that company would report to me. Now, I don't know how many levels that is, and
well, I want very earnestly to make a suggestion to you, Mr. Rawl. Whatever the success of Exxon in the past, it now has the dubious distinction of having caused one of the most severe, or perhaps the most severe, man-made disaster in environmental disaster in our history. We are constantly comparing ourselves in this country, sometimes unfavorably, sometimes I may say unfairly, with the Japanese. But as I understand their corporate structure, when something like this happens, everyone takes responsibility from the individual who was directly in cause of it up to the CEO, and everyone offers his resignation at that point so that a new team can take over and restore the credibility of the corporation. I suggest the disaster that your company has caused calls for that kind of response. I'm perfectly happy to hear your comment on it, but that expresses my opinion on this disaster.
I appreciate that expresses your opinion. I doubt if I have to comment on it, except that a lot of the Japanese kill themselves also, and I refuse to do that.
Not asking for that, but the resignation is in order.
Well, I don't think so.
Senator Kerry.
I think that notwithstanding, obviously, everybody's anger and frustration and so forth, and there isn't any real way to excuse what happened, but I don't think we gain a great deal by posturing up here at this point and somehow doing other than to say that you have recognized, and I think most people in the country appreciated the forthrightness with which you tried to at least accept responsibility and be involved in the cleanup and accept the costs thereof. There are obviously some questions, though. I mean, these things have a way of ameliorating as time goes on, and commitments can become dissipated, and other things tend to get in the way, and lawyers and so forth will be clamoring from one end of the country to the other. Let me try and see then if I can get a full understanding, because notwithstanding the press reports, I don't know how accurate and how extensive they are, as to what you see now. What have you declared as your full responsibility here? For instance, to what extent in the assessment reparation process to federal and state agencies has a process been put in place now to assess the cost to the federal government which you intend to reimburse, and what is the extent of that reimbursement?
Well, I don't really know, Senator, what the extent of it is or whether we'll reimburse the federal government. Obviously, we'll have to look into that. That hasn't been our instant concern.
Well, let me give you an example. The National Ocean Policy Subcommittee has been thirsty to encourage NOAA to be able to do considerable more on global warming, on impact of ozone, on ecosystems, so forth. Much of their resource is now going to have to be diverted to come in here to find out what the impact of oil, which settles on the bottom, is going to be on microorganisms and life systems and so forth. Will it be your intention to redress that additional cost at a time when the federal government obviously is hard-strapped?
I'll look at everything. That's all I can say.
Well, well, you know, when you get this big advertisement in these newspapers which apologizes and says we're going to cover the full cost and make it good, I mean, to what extent have you thought that out? I mean, what does making good mean? How long will the fishermen continue to be compensated for the loss of livelihood?
First thing we have to find out is what is the size of this environmental disaster. There have been a number of environmental disasters around the world. Some of them were mentioned here. Some others, like the fire off of Mexico that spilled a lot more oil than that in the Gulf of Mexico and so on and so forth, that did not have lasting effects. In terms of repay the U.S. government, a good part of the delay, in my view, early days in the delay, from the time we were ready to spray detergent, which was part of the approved plan, and it was a detergent that has been approved by the EPA. It was a detergent that's approved by the state of California, which is fairly tough on these kinds of things. 12 countries around the world, we had it available, we had aircraft, we're ready to spray, and it has been tested, and it has been in this plan for a long time, and this size spill, we couldn't get approval from Saturday morning when we requested approval on Friday. We couldn't get approval from Saturday morning until 6:45 on Sunday evening, and by then the weather had really gotten bad, as I'm sure you've heard, and blew the roof off the airport and so forth. Now, we've got some government agencies involved in that.
So
and there's some responsibility
is,
involved in that.
As a lawyer, my ears are ringing with mitigation of damages arguments.
No, I'm not mitigating anything. I'm just telling you that when you start pointing who's at fault, we say the ship went aground and we had a plan and we weren't able to start the plan. Now, as a lawyer, that may be what you're hearing. What I'm telling you, that in good conscience, we're going to try to fix. But when you start talking about compensating the U.S. government, every one of us compensates the U.S. government all the time. This company pays a lot of taxes every year. We paid a windfall profit tax for a number of years on Alaskan crude oil.
Well, I know you're not suggesting to us, because I think the chairman will go through the roof. I mean, I know you're not suggesting to us that somehow compensates for what's happened.
No, that's right. But I presume, however, that a lot of these are government services that are supposed to be provided when you have a disaster. I have a hunch that had we had a little bit more clear authority, or we had people on the ground who felt like they could exercise the authority they had, we probably could have mitigated to some extent. We wouldn't got rid of this damage, and we're going to clean the damage up.
Well, let me ask you this. In your judgment, was the Alaska plan, with which you are one of the consortia, Was that adequate?
Retrospectively, it's difficult to say it was adequate, or retrospectively, a lot of these plans, we're looking at all these plans.
Let me ask you point blank. I mean, is it difficult to say it's adequate if the maximum amount of oil the plan contemplated being prepared for was 74,000 barrels, and this spill dumped 3 times that? Is that a difficult issue to decide? Was the plan adequate?
No,
Seems to me on its face.
You're talking about the Alaskan plan to begin with, which is a plan that takes a certain amount of spill in sort of upstream, let's say, from where this tanker hit the rocks.
Well, the
other plan was the plan that the shipper was supposed to have, which we were supposed to take. But the early response was Alaskan's problem, and there was some difficulty. But I can tell you, with 200,000 barrels of oil on the water, had they had the barge in shape and so forth, and there was some great deal of problem, obviously, it's doubtful to see how that would have mitigated this problem very much, is what I'm saying.
Now, with respect to company, well, let me ask a couple more questions on that line. In terms of the restitution for the fishermen, how long does Exxon plan to provide restitution to the fishermen?
How long is the damage going to last? We'll just have to see, Senator. You know, you're talking about prospective things. I don't really know what the initial damage to the fishermen is going to be. In a lot of places, and some of them off of your home state, which I'm sure you're aware of, the great forecasts of doom didn't result. Now, that's a different environment, a different time, different kind of oil. But the facts are, we'll just have to see.
What about in terms of the cleanup, the wildlife, natural resources? Have you put a mechanism in place for determining who is going to be paid, how, and over what period of time? Or are you currently putting that in place?
On wildlife?
Correct.
What we've done is
the natural resource cleanup.
Well, we're doing it, and we have contractors doing it, and we're going to do it.
For how long? For what period of time?
Oh, until no more can be done. Now, what the damage is at that point and how long it will last, I think it was mentioned here today that sometimes you can overwork some of those environmental problems, which they did in France, with removing the sand from the beaches and so on. But we're going to get it cleaned up.
And is that notwithstanding the cap, the 14 million, and then the subsequent 76, that is notwithstanding?
Those numbers are just numbers, obviously. It was the 86, by the way. The 14 million was sort of like you'd pay on your car. You have a $200 deductible or something. We have to pay that under the TAPS operation. Then it's $100 million, which I think Senator Stevens mentioned, that gets paid by TAPS, which, by the way, we've paid 20% of that $283 million ourselves by shipping down that pipeline, which we're a 20% owner in. Then we go to other cooperatives that we belong to worldwide, a number of those. The insurance is very complex. There are a number of other questions and so forth, so we just have to see how it all works out.
Have you personally spoken to Mr. Cousins to determine what took place?
No, I have not.
Are you aware of what he says took place?
Yes, I am.
What is...
now, Cousins is the third mate. Yes.
That's correct, third mate. What is Exxon's policy when the captain is incapacitated and no other licensed or authorized personnel are on board?
I frankly don't know precisely what that policy is.
Is there a policy?
I'm sure there is.
But you're not aware of it?
I haven't asked. I've asked a lot of questions. I haven't asked that one.
Did, to your knowledge, Mr. Cousins act in conformance with company policy by assuming command of the ship under that situation?
I don't know the policy, but I doubt it. But I really don't know the policy.
And notwithstanding that, you're currently representing him. Your lawyers are representing him.
We're representing him until and you say I thought you said you're a lawyer. Obviously, everybody has a right to representation, and if he's not really at fault here, temporarily we're representing him until
But you have made no determination based on this conversation with him as to what happened?
I didn't have the conversation. One of our lawyers had the conversation.
I understand, but from what's been reported to you, you have made no determination as to whether or not he acted in conformance with company policy.
I don't know.
Is the Valdez equipped to maintain communications with Exxon headquarters during transit?
We don't, you're talking about Exxon headquarters. We're talking about an office in New York where I work. And
No, I'm talking about up in the region.
They're presumably have radio equipment that can communicate with various points where we have people that stay in touch with the ships. But I don't know precisely what equipment, radio equipment they have on. But they've had no trouble communicating to my knowledge.
Are there situations in the past that you're aware of where an unlicensed person has taken control of one of your ships?
Not that I'm aware of.
Can you give us some idea of the impact of this reduction from the North Slope on crude oil supplies in the lower 48 states in terms of gasoline prices and supply?
Well, it's had some impact. And at times it's been substantial. And of course, every time someone, possibly the governor of Alaska, says we're going to shut down the pipeline or we're going to open the pipeline, the oil market is very volatile these days. The world oil market's very volatile. Every time an OPEC minister clears his throat, the market sometimes goes up and down. We've had a tight supply situation relatively in gasoline in this country since last year. Demand is up, as you know, and there have been some refinery turnarounds. Now, there's more product moving to the West Coast. We've moved a lot from the Gulf to the West Coast, or we're trying to get it out there. But the crude price went down yesterday for West Texas Intermediate pricing. That was predicated on the fact that the word was out that the ship was off the rock. Then when they start talking about something else, I don't know, Senator, how to express. It's tight but manageable on the West Coast. I hope now that that ship is out of the way, if we can operate those ships in and out with whatever kind of regulations transpire, we can relieve the anxiety, and it's sort of a psychological thing when it gets to gasoline anyway, as I'm sure you know. People buy it when they don't even need it and concerned about running out of it.
Obviously, you've heard the many people who have said, you know, this was never supposed to happen, all guarantees were given, so forth, plans were in place and everything, but once again, you know, humans seem to have found a way to defy the odds. Is there a lesson that you would draw from this in terms of our future efforts with respect to oil exploration and delivery?
Well, obviously there were a couple of situations that we have looked at and we're taking some steps on. In terms of oil exploration, I think we need it in this country. I think it's very, as you know, I don't have to quote a lot of figures, we're importing 40+% of the oil we consume. We have a balance of payments problem, but we also have tankers, and some of which Exxon doesn't own, thank God, transit when we're not working on this other out of Alaska.
What I'm really getting at, Mr. Rawl, is, I mean, you look at all the circumstances now that in summary seem to be very disturbing. You got a pilot who may have gotten off before the ship was at the point it should have been. You've got
I have not heard that before, but
well,
I don't know.
I'm just saying
I see.
Allegation
Okay.
in the air.
A lot of allegations.
You got a ship that changed course, third mate, so forth, captain incapacitated. You've got a Coast Guard that didn't have positive control, had radar working, people I mean, it seems as though, this is sort of like Murphy's Law, but it seems like there was a complacency in a very risky process where major guarantees had been given to citizens, not just in Alaska, who are most profoundly affected, but all over this country, about this process. And would you say it's fair to say there was a real complacency about, I mean, the plan for cleanup wasn't adequate? Even if the plan had worked according to the way it was supposed to work, it wouldn't have done the job. It wasn't enough. The ship was far in excess in terms of capacity for spill and so forth. It seems like I heard, you know, Sam Skinner say earlier, there's no magic solution. I don't think we're looking for a magic solution. I think we're looking for just basics that avoid a kind of negligence.
I think you've used the word guarantee a number of times. I think it was been clearly stated all the time that there were no guarantees in these kind of things, just as the Secretary
I'm not
Skinner.
talking about a guarantee.
No, I
I'm talking
understand,
about the elimination of sort of a fundamental risk level.
Yeah,
and it
now,
seems to me there was a complacency here.
It's fair to say that when you get into large spills, you're not going to guarantee anything, but you're going to make every effort to avoid them. It's like airplane crashes or whatever else happens. But that's what you can do.
Yeah, but you see, what you're saying there is that there's a higher expectancy then that you're going to get into a large spill.
No, there's not a higher expectancy. This one shouldn't have happened. I've said that. The equipment is state of the art. This isn't an old tramp steamer we're talking about. This is a $125 million ship. But
well, it's not state of the art. I mean, maybe when somebody's trying to turn the wheel and the computer system is governing it, there should be an alarm bell that goes off that tells them immediately.
We'll have to find out what the facts are in that regard. The man says that he turned that automatic pilot off, but certainly if you turn the wheel, I presume if you're an experienced person, and he's experienced, he's run ships in the oceans, and I suppose you can tell whether you're getting, I used to have a boat, not any longer, but you can tell whether the rudder's having some effect on that. And if you haven't punched the right button, you punch the right button. You just don't keep going and run into something. Now, why they got out of that channel, I have no earthly knowledge of that, Senator. I just can't tell you why. But we're going to make every effort to find it out. We'll just have to see.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rawl, he was an experienced third mate in radio contact. Did he not get permission to take over from the master?
I don't really know that, Senator. I just don't know how that works, frankly. I assume not because I haven't heard that, but I really don't know that.
Do you know whether or not they do have radio contact?
I don't know whether at that particular point in time. I know they had radio contact with the Coast Guard. And I know if he had said to the Coast Guard, I want to take over, or the captain wants me to take over, they'd say, you're not the licensed pilot or something. So I presume he wouldn't have asked anyone, but I'm just presuming. I really don't know.
Well, then, that's a good answer because the requirements for the master license for a master pilot is very precise, very stringent. And the testimony has been crystal clear that there was only one licensed.
Correct.
And certainly that Exxon is not contending that you can countermand the license requirements.
No, absolutely not.
So when asked about the policy, you don't have to say you don't know. You do know the policy, that you do not countermand.
Okay.
Okay, you and I...
Well, but of course, there could be a circumstance, as you said earlier, where someone has a heart attack or something, and somebody says, can I park the ship or whatever?
They still wouldn't be licensed.
No, but you can't just tell them to let it run itself, obviously, if the captain just fell dead or if the pilot...
now that is the policy of Exxon right now. You do not have a policy for a co-pilot.
No, but we have a circumstance we have a circumstance that I mentioned earlier that it's my understanding the Coast Guard permits 2 officers to take over in those kind of circumstances. We have a number of officers that could have been on the bridge or could be on the bridge in that drop-dead circumstance. But, you're getting me into...
No, I'm only getting you into what I know, and I'm very inexperienced on the whole question, but right to the point, if that master had a heart attack, it was a policy of Exxon that it should just run itself because, at least unlicensed, right? Because you didn't have anybody licensed to take over from him. That's your policy.
But we had people that could run the ship. We had people that could take...
Well, let's don't equate run the ship with a licensed pilot. I mean, we know this fellow couldn't run the ship. He ran it into the rocks.
I just said that, as I understand it, and I have a lawyer over here who can tell me again if I'm not stating it properly, that you could have 2 officers on the deck, along with the helmsman, in addition, without the captain there, I guess, or without the licensed pilot. But if you want to quiz me on the rules of the road of the Coast Guard, you got the wrong witness. I'll get somebody up here who can spend all day talking about this stuff, and you won't find out a whole heck of a lot.
Well, we all know the rules of the road of the Coast Guard with respect to licensing someone as the master of that fella, as the master pilot, and you had one.
Yes, sir.
And no more than one?
On that ship at that time. And if it's appropriate, we'll have more than one in the future. But
if it's appropriate. When asked by Senator Kerry if you'd learned anything, you don't think you at least learned that it was not adequate and we ought to have a valuable ship of 125
well, but you see,
million?
I'm not sure, Senator, since this master has had it indicated that he was under the influence of alcohol sometime after this, correct? But had he been piloting the ship himself, who was a licensed pilot, it's very possible we'd have had the same circumstance. I don't know that. It's sort of, we're speculating what might have happened, but you know, a license doesn't necessarily make anybody effective, whether they're piloting an airplane or a ship or something. But the facts are, you brought up a good question that I've raised and we're chasing it.
It's not your contention that the vessel should have been controlled by Coast Guard radar at the time of the collision that it collided with the rock, went aground?
My contention is, or all I know about it is, the weather was clear. There was ice out there, which they were trying to...
I'm not asking about the weather condition. I'm asking about the Coast Guard radar.
I understand. I'm answering the question. It's pretty obvious that this shouldn't have happened whether the Coast Guard had the radar on or didn't, or controlled it or didn't.
Excuse me. I'm asking whether you think the Coast Guard should have had radar control under any circumstance.
I think it would have, obviously, we'd be pleased if the Coast Guard had called early in the morning on 24th and said, take a right turn, get back in the channel or something like that. You know, it would have saved us a heck of a lot of money and saved the government money too.
That's a hypothetical. What is the actual policy? Do you think it was a responsibility? Do you think it was the Coast Guard responsibility to continue with radar coverage of that vessel?
I can't comment on it, Senator. I have not studied that. I don't know what their obligations are in that regard in ports, other ports.
Well, what is your reaction? I take it you think Exxon is performing adequately up there now in Valdez. Is that correct?
I think we've done a very good job of getting the ship off the rocks and getting the oil out of it, and that was no mean feat, because when you have a ship foundering on a reef and you bring up other large ships, I think that's been good. I think in terms of the cleanup, it's been mentioned many times, the high tide, very high tides, we're chasing the oil, we're doing what we can, and we're going to use all the resources available to us. But some of this stuff, as was talked about before, it's moving fast. We're now starting to clean up islands that we're convinced that it's passed instead of ebb and flow and so forth. But I think we're doing a good job.
Well, then what's your reaction to the governor of Alaska's suggestion that they take over, that the Coast Guard take over the project from Exxon?
I think we'll just have to look at that.
Well, I know we're both going to look at it, but I mean, what's your reaction?
Well, if somebody has a real instant cure for this, I'd be delighted. But the facts are, I have a hunch that we're going to have to keep up there and keep doing what I told Senator Stevens we were going to do. Now, some of the delay, as I mentioned early on in this thing, was because we had a lot of help in getting started.
Senator Stevens, we have kept the Admiral Yost, the Commandant of the Guard, and he's ready to testify, and we've got two other important witnesses. Do you have any questions right now? I want to thank Mr. Rawl for his appearance.
I understand while I was gone, just one thing. Mr. Rawl, when I was in Valdez, I asked about the dispersants. And I asked if there was an exercise last summer of the contingency plan. I asked if this particular dispersant had been used and certified as a result of that run-through of the contingency plan. And I was told it had not, that this dispersant that you tried to your company tried to use this time had never been approved before by the Coast Guard or by the fisheries people. Did you know that?
No, sir, I did not know that. I know that it's approved, that this dispersant, this Corexit dispersant, has been part of that contingency plan in terms of understanding. It's been tested many times. It's been approved in California.
I understand it, but it had not been tested there and approved there for those waters with the fisheries conditions that were there, is what I was told.
Well, let me tell you that this is not toxic. It's not, well, the toxicity is a magnitude less than the toxicity of crude oil, Senator. So, you know, the point is, if they were concerned about toxicity, rather than whether it performed well or not. The toxicity is not a problem. If we were willing to spray it and it didn't perform well in terms of mitigating the spill, which it did, we tested it and it did, but we should have been spraying earlier than that. But that would have been just more expense for us. We still don't understand the delay in it. But that's,
I don't want to believe it. I was told it's only effective on fresh oil. That once the oil is not fresh, it would not disperse.
well, it's less effective when the oil is not fresh, but we were talking about pretty fresh oil. This oil was still spreading, and a lot of the, originally on Saturday we had a 4 miles by 1 mile, basically. And then it grew, as you know, and then when the wind came up Sunday night, it really got strung out down there. We had an opportunity to mitigate that spill considerably. Of course, after that, a lot of it vaporized. 40% of the oil that went out is already vaporized and, disappeared. But then we have the gunk we now have that we're trying to work with.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, Mr. Rawl, the committee appreciates your willingness to testify and your appearance here today. Thank you, sir. Admiral Yost, our commandant. Admiral Yost, the committee is indebted to you for 2 appearances, I guess, over at the host side earlier and now coming to us. We do appreciate it. We've had Secretary Skinner and Captain Larrabee go into some detail, and if they've decided anything, you're the man in charge. We gladly accept your statement in its entirety, and you can give it in its entirety, highlight it as you wish. The hour is late, and we've got 2 other very important witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, I think that I would like to go immediately to the questions to save us both time, sir.
Very good, sir. Go right ahead. Well, if you want to answer questions, now let me ask this with respect to the license and requirements of a master pilot of a vessel. As I understand, on the original license application, if I'd never been licensed before, you'd do a background on me on the original application. Is that correct?
The original application for a license is somewhat more complete than is a renewal. And in that original application, there's a requirement to report any drug use, any convictions of serious crimes and those kinds of things. On a renewal, it's less obvious, but there's still a requirement on a renewal to report, for instance, convictions in the last 5 years.
Well, on those convictions in the last 5 years, it would have shown here in this particular case, at least perhaps we've learned that. I know the Coast Guard has been a leader on random drug testing, and alcohol both, and it's diminished its occurrence markedly. Yes. And we've congratulated the Guard on that accomplishment. Now, with respect to the licensees of the Guard, what do you think with respect to that now, transmitting that particular requirement or policy to the licensees?
The system is basically the licensee must report in his application. In this case, the master did not report in his application the convictions he had for driving while under the influence. That was absent from his application. Now, we have 25,000 applications a year that we process. It's impossible with the current level of computerization and manning to do a background check on every application. The system is that if there is abuse on the vessel, the master is responsible for reporting that abuse to the Coast Guard, and we would then proceed against the license of the officer involved. In this case, the master himself was abusing, and nobody reported it.
Is there a backup requirement if the master himself is the one under the influence?
Yes, there is. The chief
What
mate,
is that?
the chief mate and the chief engineer have a responsibility to take over the operation of the ship if they feel the master is incapacitated.
But they were asleep.
They may have been asleep at the time of the collision. I doubt if they were asleep at the time the vessel left the dock. Whether they knew that the condition of the master is going to be developed in the Board of Investigation.
So it did go down to the third mate, and he was not licensed.
Well, the third mate did not have a first-class pilotage license for that particular area. That area requires, from Hitchenbrook on in, a first-class pilotage license. It allows that requirement to be filled by a ship's officer up to Rocky Point, where the normal state pilot gets aboard, the federal pilot. That vessel was in an area that required pilotage by a ship's officer. The master was the only one that had that pilotage. The third mate was qualified to operate the vessel but did not have pilotage for the area, so should not have been on the bridge by himself. That's very clear.
On this particular point, would you recommend or have considered a co-pilot being required, or was this an aberration here on this particular vessel, and do they regularly have at least two licensed? It seems like when these things put to sea, and that's a long voyage and bad weather, and I've heard of good pilots getting seasick as a dog and they'd as soon die, could give up the vessel and everything else. What about co-pilot, or what is the policy, if any?
That's right. Well, we ought to perhaps examine, and will, whether more than one officer on a ship ought to have first-class pilotage for that particular area of Port William Sound. Now, I understand that a state pilot and a U.S. pilot, a federal pilot, is required in the Narrows. Now, I would assume that that means that in the Narrows, as you go on up, you've got to have a state pilot, somebody with state pilotage license, as well as an officer on the vessel with pilotage.
Right. But beyond where the collision occurred, there's only the requirement, as far as the Coast Guard is concerned, you could not have gone out there, let's assume there wasn't an accident that particular evening, and you found just the captain aboard, and let's forget about the alcohol. You wouldn't have arrested the captain or charged him with anything because he was the only one licensed, would you, or
No,
would you?
but we would have charged him if he were the only one licensed and he wasn't on the bridge. He would have been in serious trouble. His license would have been in jeopardy at that point.
Right.
The question is, should we require two officers with pilotage on these long voyages with pilotage for Hitchenbrook on in? That's a question we ought to look at.
And super tankers, because, well, let me go to that question. Double hulk or double hull of a vessel like we require for chemical in the natural gas vessels and everything else required for safety. It has been attested that that would not have saved this particular oil spill, or am I right or wrong on that?
Well, we don't know for sure. We'll have to see what the extent of the damage was. It's probable that the damage was deep enough in that vessel, up through the bottom, that double bottoms would not have helped. That's very probable. We won't know till we get her in dry dock.
Then the question is whether we go back to smaller tankers rather than the 240,000 barrels, go back to the $74,000 barrel type tankers that we used to have, because we just can't afford this kind of catastrophe hereafter. I mean, the environment, the fisheries are such a precious resource that on the safety side, just like out on the highway, we won't allow, I know my trucker friends like to have tandem trucks, and some of them would like to have 3 tandems. You can't get by them, you can't pass them. So as a policy matter, we say you can't have 3 tandems, let's say. Maybe as a policy matter, this super tanker is showing us, as they're trying to attest, that Alaska could not have had sufficient equipment to have arrested or stayed the spill in any real marked degree, that it still would have continued to have spilled. I thought if they'd gotten out there promptly, maybe they could have prevented it, but I'm confused in my mind. What's your comment with respect to both, namely a smaller tanker on the one hand and Alaska's capacity and responsibility both?
Yeah. Last year, we had about 2,000 tanker passages in that strait. Those are with, let's say, 240,000 barrel tankers. Let's go to a smaller tanker, half that size. If we had half that size tankers, instead of 2,000 passages, we're going to have 4,000 passages. I don't know what the trade-off is between the greater risk of twice the number of passages and the lesser risk of only having half the oil aboard in case you do get in trouble. There's a trade-off there, and it'll have to be looked at and has been. Now, as far as the response, let me say this. The Alaska plan provided for a 5-hour response. That was not met. And it is my view, in any spill, that the sooner you get there and you get the boom around the spill, the better off you are. I would have been delighted had we had that thing boomed in 5 hours. We didn't. We didn't get the boom there until 10, 12 hours. And then it takes a while to boom it. And shortly thereafter, a 70-knot wind came up and it blew everything, boom, and everything else away. So I would have been much better pleased with a better response. Whether it would have made a great deal of difference is problematical. And I could discuss the dispersants in the same general way.
Let me yield to Senator Stevens. He's got to leave.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I do. This historical meeting going on in the Senate, I'm part of it, and I've just been called. I'd ask that you let Senator Murkowski sit in for us during the balance of this hearing, if you would. I do want to speak to the Coast Guard about establishing a vessel control system in this area like we have in the Puget Sound. This is 25% of the nation's oil moving through that passage. And I have the correspondence. I complained to Admiral Gracie when they changed the radar that shortened the capability of that radar. I think this now requires that we take firm action to assure that this area will be controlled, as you have a control system in Puget Sound. I have some other questions, but Mr. Chairman, I've got to go make that speech.
I'm supposed to be over there too, but this is
I understand.
far more requiring right now.
It is, and you embarrass me, but
yeah.
the President Pro Tem says I'm to make a speech. Are you to make a speech?
That might be the best speech you ever made to stay here. You and I.
You go make the speech then, Senator Murkowski, and I'll say.
Senator Murkowski has been very understanding of the committee policy because it really raised an issue with other senators heretofore, and I'm going to make sure that I can ask the question. Right to the point, Admiral Yost, what is your reaction to the governor of Alaska's request that the Coast Guard take over the project up there from Exxon?
Yeah. The governor and I are not very far apart on this. We don't want to federalize this spill. We don't want to take the responsibility for funding the spill. It's going about $1 million a day. We've got about $3 or $4 million left in the 311K fund. I don't know what I'd do on the 4th day if we federalized it. The governor hasn't asked for that. What he has suggested is more control by the Coast Guard, more direction, more guidance, and I'm pretty much in consonance with that, and that's what's happening there yesterday and today. A discussion between Exxon and ourselves about the Coast Guard stepping more in to the direction and guidance of the cleanup. We're organized for that. We're a pyramid organization, a military organization. Exxon is a business, and we're ready to do an operational thing. They're having a little trouble doing it, in my view, and that means we need to step further into it without federalizing it, without removing liability, without us funding it, but with more guidance and direction, and we're doing that.
Well, I'm reading from Governor Cooper's letter. Due to its unique formal responsibilities and familiarity with the Alaska coastline, we believe the Coast Guard is uniquely suited to coordinate the response. That's not whether you get further or you don't get further. That's whether you really coordinate the response as the governor of Alaska is requesting. Do you agree with that?
I'm in consonance with that, yes. We're going to do much more coordination and guidance than we have up to now, but we don't want to federalize it, not yet.
I'm trying to find out the difference in my mind between federalizing and you taking over prime responsibility for coordination.
All right, let me speak to that.
Yes, sir.
Federalizing means that we take over all the control and the direction, we take over the contracting, and we give rudder orders to everybody up there. That means I need about 30 contracting officers up there to contract with every fishing boat, every fisherman, every company, everybody who's working for us. To coordinate it means that we allow Exxon to continue to fund it, to keep their checkbook open, to do the contracting with the cleanup people, and we basically direct and guide Exxon in where we want to clean up, where we want the skimmers, where we want the boom, how much boom tending, where we want the beach cleaners, that kind of thing. And we'll perhaps bring in some other federal forces at the same time.
And what do you mean by yet? And when you get the other federal forces in?
When would I propose to do this? We're doing it as we sit here, and we're transferring that guidance and direction more to the Coast Guard and discussing that with Exxon. I'm not privy to what's happened since this morning.
So the Coast Guard is responding affirmatively to the governor's request, as you see it?
Yes, we were doing it at the time he requested it. We'd been talking to the governor all along and with Exxon about doing this. We're talking to Mr. Arasi this morning about moving people into their operations center and taking over some of this operational guidance.
And no emergency legislation is necessary?
No, sir. At least if it were, I think the president would request it. As you know, I was in the Oval Office with the president and with Mr. Riley and others yesterday discussing some of these same matters with the Alaska delegation.
With respect to radar guidance, it's not the Coast Guard's position, policy, or responsibility that that ship at the time of the collision be under radar guidance, is it?
No, we don't do radar control in the way that FAA does aircraft control in any waters, any place. What we do is it's an advisory service, and we tell the vessel what vessels they're liable to meet and those other things that complicate their passage. Yeah. Now in Valdez, we do more than we do any place else. We forbid traffic except one-way traffic through the Narrows. And we track that vessel in the Narrows. We plot it every 3 minutes while it's inside. Once it gets out of the Narrows, just short of Rocky Point, we quit plotting it at that point. It's at sea. They discharge their state pilot. They go out to sea under the officer aboard, pilotage.
Is your effort stultified or arrested or restricted in any way by budgetary constraints?
Well, no, I don't think it was, but I think it's only fair for me to tell.
Well, how about is? I mean, in the future here, because, you know, you got a sympathetic committee that's proud of you and the Guard, and I don't want to hear, in fact, I've got a suspicion now. One said they only had $3 million in a fund over at the Secretary of Transportation. And it seemed like there could have been a hesitancy because there was only $3 million there, and they didn't want to sort of assume the responsibility for a $100 to $200 million project with only $3 million sitting in the fund. And
well, that's very true. That fund has never been much more than 15 million, something in there. It's now at 3. I'd be more comfortable with it at 10 or 12. We may take a look at that and ask our committees to take a look at it. But as far as the operation of the Vessel Traffic Service, the only effect on that, and I don't think it's a serious one, we're looking at it, was in the 1988 budget cut that the Coast Guard took. We removed 7 people from the Valdez Vessel Traffic Service and reduced the watch from 2 on watch to 1 on watch. Now, it was our view in taking that budget cut of initially $103 million that we would take it from areas that were least, where the need was least. And our feeling at that time was that we could remove a watchstander from Valdez. We did that. Now, if I were to do that this morning, I would probably have a different decision on whether to remove a watchstander from Valdez. I don't think it had an effect in this accident.
Let's assume, is there anything you need from the Congress?
I'm sorry, sir.
Is there anything you need from the Congress?
Well, no. The President's budget is coming up here. It's an austere budget. It's one I said I can live with. It's one I said I won't have to close any Coast Guard units. But in 1988, I closed 2 vessel traffic services, one in New York Harbor. I'm glad this spill wasn't in New York Harbor, because I'd be asking, why did you close the vessel traffic system in New York Harbor? You know, I closed 2, one in New York Harbor and one in New Orleans, 2 biggest ports in the United States because of a budget cut. So when you ask me what do I need the President's budget, but the President's budget does not envision reopening those 2 vessel traffic services. I haven't asked for them. I did reduce Valdez.
What should the committee or Congress learn? Let's assume you at the Coast Guard Academy several years hence, and 2 weeks have passed, and on reflection, what should we have learned with respect to this particular collision disaster?
Well, let me talk first broadly in terms of the support the Coast Guard gets from Congress. We've always had trouble getting a reasonable budget within this government, and that includes the United States Congress. We come up here year after year with a budget that is austere, and we normally leave this area with a budget less than our austere budget. So I think that every time we close a Coast Guard station, we close a lifeboat station, we close a vessel traffic service, we assume more risk as the American people for accidents someplace. Now, I don't believe this accident is the responsibility of having closed something. But you ask what the Congress can do. I think the Congress ought to support the Coast Guard in the appropriations area. This authorization committee has been wonderful to us, sir. I'm talking about the appropriations area, needs to support the Coast Guard at a higher level than they normally do.
And what have we learned environmentally and maritimely about this particular incident? Is there anything, for one thing, I'm not expert enough to ask the question that Senator Stevens was getting at, but it seems like a harbor pilot was required further or beyond up to the point even of this rock, but somehow that was cut back, that requirement, to a point several
years
back.
ago.
Yes, sir.
We had pilotage from Hitchenbrook on in, required a state pilot. The only people that were required, the only vessels that were required were foreign vessels to take on a state pilot at Hitchenbrook. We had an injury of pilots trying to get aboard in that extremely rough weather of Hitchenbrook, and so that requirement was knocked off. But there were only 9 vessels that were foreign vessels in the system. I think what we should have learned, and what we have learned, and there'll be more lessons coming out of the investigation, is that in this day and age, we have got to tighten up the application requirements and the background look at people coming in for licenses. We've got to have a better feel for a man who comes in and falsifies, if that's the case here, falsifies an application by not putting on convictions he's had for drunk driving. People could come in and falsify drug use that is asked for in the application, and I think they will. I don't think people will write down drug use on an application for a license. And they avoid writing down DWI on licenses. And we need to somehow get behind that application and see what's happening to these people.
But no one in the audience would want to fly home this afternoon in a commercial flight that had only one pilot. They wouldn't want to get on that plane. I mean, we're not talking about people just getting drunk. Just normal things can occur to an individual, heart attacks and otherwise they have. And with a 3 vessel as long as 3 football fields, 125 million, a million gallons of fuel aboard and everything else like that, it seems rather puny and nonsensical to just have one master license to board ship to take it. I guess in some instances here, in many instances, these super tankers go all the way to Saudi Arabia and come back, Persian Gulf.
Yes,
They're on the high seas. I just can't understand that particular.
All right. Let me comment on that then, sir.
Yes, sir.
Every vessel of that size doesn't have a pilot and a co-pilot as an aircraft would have. It has a pilot, a master mate, a second mate, a third mate. So it has at least 4 officers that are completely qualified to run that vessel. What it doesn't have is more than 1 officer required that has pilotage for the particular area that they're coming into, whether it's New York Harbor or Amsterdam or Prince William Sound. Now, to require 2 people on the vessel that all have pilotage for each area they come into would be an added requirement. I don't object to that. We ought to look at it. But don't think that they don't have somebody who's qualified to run that ship from the bridge. They got 4 people. And for that third mate, who is a qualified officer, has passed the examinations, who's had a lot of trips into Valdez, to have run that ship up on the beach, there's something awful happened on that bridge, some kind of a loss of continuity, a loss of something that we don't know yet. But there's no reason that that third mate wasn't completely competent to run that ship where he was in the area he was. He had the competency. He didn't have the license, and the master should have been on the bridge. Those are faults. But we don't have a bumbling idiot on the bridge. We got a guy who's well licensed and trained.
And by way of visibility, he should have been able at least to see the channel markers.
Well, yes, sir. It was a clear night. You could see forever. The buoy, he almost ran over the buoy to get on the rock.
That's what I was thinking, because I think your comment has already been made public that there was a 10-mile wide channel there, and my boy Michael could have run the boat through there.
Well, that played a lot better outside the Beltway than it did inside the Beltway, so I'm trying to get rid of that comment.
Have you notified, you remember the governor of Alaska had cited that 40 Code of Federal Regulations, Section 300. Are you ready to notify the governor now that you will take over immediately the coordination of the project up there at Alaskan?
The governor has asked.
Valdez.
Yes, the governor has asked that the disaster have a federal input outside of the Clean Water Act. And that isn't my responsibility. He's asked what Senator Stevens was talking about to open up the Small Business Administration funds and some other association funds to that. The senator says, no, I may be wrong. He has not asked to federalize the spill. What he has asked is for the Coast Guard to take more of a directive action in this spill, and I'm in consonance with him, and we're talking about that right now with Exxon on scene in Alaska. And if it's necessary, I will go up there myself and set that up the way it ought to be.
Well, I think the governor has been more specific. He refers to that section of 40 Code of Federal Regulations, Section 300, and that gives a specific authority and responsibility for coordination.
Is that the Clean Water Act you're talking about?
Yep.
Okay. The governor is back. He's asked for that once. He's backed away from it. It's not my understanding that he has asked for it again this morning. He's asked for the...
Well, we have the letter. We'll furnish you a copy of the letter. Yeah, he's asked for it again.
What's the date on it, sir?
April the 5th. What's the date? Yeah, he got it in 8 o'clock last night.
He's got better mail service than I have within D.C.
Yes, sir. Yeah, well, we'll get this letter to you.
Yes, sir.
Is there... when you say that the law, you know, for Alaska oil can only move in U.S. flag vessels, yet I understand, Admiral, you say that 9 foreign vessels have gone to Valdez to load oil over a period of time?
Yes, there's 9 foreign vessels in the trade. All of them terminate at St. Croix. St. Croix has a U.S. refinery, but is not U.S. territory.
Yeah, I see.
Now let me again say I am not prepared to federalize this spill in the legal sense of the word, because it would open up to me and to the 311K fund the responsibility to fund it. And I've only got $2 or $3 million in that fund, and we're spending $1 million a day. I want to do something short of federalization. We will assume the responsibility for on-scene guidance and direction to Exxon in doing this. We'll take basically a lot more control than we have now, but we want to stop short of federalization. That might require legally Exxon to close their checkbooks to the fishermen and everybody else. I don't want to do that, and I don't think the governor does either. I didn't know he said federalization. He talked about control, but I didn't know. I have to have a copy
Well,
of that.
you'll have a chance to clarify and coordinate with him. Is there anything you wish to add to your testimony here this morning? We do appreciate you coming over.
No, I want to say this one other thing, though, that I don't feel that I'm at odds with Mr. Rawl. I am concerned that he's placing too much emphasis on the timing of the dispersants and too much emphasis on what could have been had dispersants been put in the water. The federal on-scene coordinator and the state people made, in my opinion, the right decision, which was don't let dispersants go in the water unless they're going to be effective. And in their view, they would not have been effective because there wasn't enough wave action to mix it up, and the spill and there weren't enough dispersants on hand at that point. We had 10 million gallons of oil in the water, and they had a few tens of thousands of dispersants, or a few thousand gallons of dispersant. It was a drop in the bucket. It would not have made a difference. They made the right decision, and then when the wind did come up, they blew everything away and there wasn't any chance for dispersal.
What about Alaska's readiness? I understand their barge to carry out the booms had a puncture in it, and they're sitting around starting to repair it.
I'm very disappointed with that they weren't able to execute their plan. Now, that's not a federal plan, it's not a Coast Guard plan, it's a plan arrived at as a requirement by the state of Alaska before they would permit Alaska to come in there. And that was arrived at by those two parties. It was a plan that they should have been able to execute. For a number of reasons, they weren't. I think anytime you're time late at a spill, then you're in major trouble. Every hour you're late multiplies the problem. They should have been there within 5 hours. They weren't.
Very good, Admiral Yost. We appreciate it very much, your appearance here today for the committee. And now, finally, we have a panel. The record will stay open for further questions by my colleagues. We have the panel of Dr. Evans, the Undersecretary of Commerce, Oceans and Atmosphere, and Mr. Steve Robinson, the Deputy Director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. We'll ask them to come forward. Pretty damn good record. I think so. Yeah. Appreciate you. We haven't had it. No, it's worth fine. Yeah. Each clarified. Yeah.
That's fine. We'll gotta work that out.
Yeah.
That's our
Good. Yeah, we hadn't had that messing bomb thing. I'd have had you up here at the very beginning. It suited me. Yeah. Mr. Evans, Mr. Robinson, we do appreciate your indulgence, and we apologize, but you can see we've tried to move along as quickly as possible. Your statements both will be included in the record in their entirety, and you can highlight it or give them. You've been indulgent with the committee, and we'll be indulgent with you. You can give the statement in full or highlight it. Dr. Evans?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Because of the seriousness of what we're discussing here, I have brought Dr. Ehler, who is the head of our group that deals with hazardous material, and his team is the team that has been working up on this oil spill from about 11 hours after it was actually happened. I also have legal counsel with me, Mr. Campbell, who's here in case, since I am not a lawyer. I know there's a lot of people who were saying that they were lawyers and using that as an excuse. I am not a lawyer, so I brought one with me.
I can see you're very proud of that.
What I would like to do, Mr. Chairman, is to go through a lot of the testimony and read it because I think it's important, but I will highlight it. I'll drop some of the material out. By April 2nd, the oil from this spill, the 11 million gallons, had spread throughout an area of more than 800 square miles. Approximately 1/3 of the total surface of Prince William Sound. Prevailing currents and winds are moving the oil in a southwesterly direction through Montague Straits towards the open waters of the Gulf of Alaska. The rocky shores of Naked, Knight, Smith, and Green Islands have been very heavily oiled. The oil is expected to follow the coastline of the Kenai Peninsula, where it could impact biologically productive and scenic areas such as Blying Sound, Resurrection Bay, and the Kenai Fjord National Park. The economy of the area that we're talking about is based on natural resources and includes one, commercial fishing, which we've heard a great deal about. Prince William Sound supports major commercial fishing for salmon, herring, as well as smaller fisheries for king crab, shrimp, halibut. These commercial fisheries are renewable resources that each year are worth over $100 million to that community. Recreation, the relative accessibility of Prince William Sound to Anchorage, the major population center of Alaska, makes it a favorite of local and visiting recreationists who use it either individually in organized tours for fishing, sightseeing, kayaking, and camping. There's also a number of cruise ships that come into the area, and we don't even have the idea of what the economic impact is going to be on that. There's subsistent fishing and hunting, logging, oil transportation. Port Valdez, located in the northeastern portion of Prince William Sound, is the southern terminus, as we know, of the Trans-Alaskan pipeline. Perhaps most devastating with this sad event was the timing of the spill. As the harsh Alaskan winter turned into spring, the irreplaceable resources of Prince William Sound are the most in jeopardy. This is a time when we have a lot of larval fish, a lot of fish are coming in for purposes of spawning, and this is the most vulnerable time for them. For example, migrating herring are finally in the Sound and would be available for harvest. The spill occurred just days before the scheduled opening of this fishery, which had to be canceled. This means it not only lost jobs and income, but also lost export value to the United States. But more valuable even than the herring is the salmon fishery. All 5 species of salmon are supported by Prince William Sound in this river system. Adult fish will be affected when they return to the Sound this spring and summer, but juvenile salmon are now ready to enter the estuaries that have been damaged by the spill and will begin feeding on resources that have already been damaged. This is the time of their life cycle that they are most dependent on the marine environment impacted by the spill, and there is a good chance that many of these fish will not survive. The effects will be felt years down the road when these fish are not available as adults for spawning, and the loss will likely ripple far into the future. The effects of these natural resources and their human uses form the basis for the damage assessment work that will be undertaken by the co-trustees. In this case, NOAA acts on behalf of the Secretary of Commerce as a federal trustee for natural resource and coastal and marine areas. The Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of Agriculture, and since this incident occurred in state waters, the state of Alaska also have significant trustee interests. NOAA's Damage Assessment Authority is derived from the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, the Clean Water Act, as well as other resource management statutes which provide the legal procedural framework for claims against potentially responsible parties for losses resulting from injury to the natural resources caused by oil spills. Based on these legal authorities, NOAA has 4 principal responsibilities during and after an oil spill. As a scientific support coordinator to the U.S. Coast Guard on-scene coordinator, specifically the NOAA actually provides liaison between natural resource, chemical, medical, and other scientific experts and the on-scene coordinator, models trajectories of spilled oil to predict its future movements, assesses the nature, behavior, and fate of the oil pollutants, for example, chemical sampling and analysis, identification of toxic properties and alteration of physical and chemical characteristics under various environmental conditions, advises on safety precautions for response personnel, identifies areas of biological importance requiring protection, and helps the on-scene coordinator respond to inquiries from local, state, and federal agencies for assistance in scientific studies and environmental assessment, and assists the on-scene coordinator's public relations efforts on scientific issues. As a member of the regional response team, NOAA assists in the preparation of federal recommendations to the on-scene coordinator. As a federal trustee for living marine resources, NOAA is responsible for identifying injuries to the resources, assessing losses associated with injury to the natural resources, and bringing claims against the responsible parties. As the nation's principal marine pollution research and monitoring agency, NOAA examines the long-term ecological consequences. Currently, we have 25 experts on site at the Exxon Valdez spill, including people from NOAA's Hazardous Material Response Team, the National Marine Mammal Laboratory, the National Marine Fisheries Service, Auk Bay Laboratory, the Office of Aircraft Operations, the University of Alaska Sea Grant Program, and the National Weather Service. NOAA's hazardous material response experts have conducted extensive overflights of the spreading oil in coastal reaches of Prince William Sound to monitor the slick movement and to identify the threatened areas. In fact, the NOAA Hazardous Materials Response Team probably has more collective experience in marine oil spills than probably any other group in the world. That have occurred in the last 13 years. They have been involved in almost all of those. There's about 15 years experience, and they have been involved in working on about 2,000 oil spills, including the Argo Merchant, the Amoco Cadiz, and the Itak blowout.
Now, what did we learn, let's say, from the Cadiz, which was a mammoth oil spill there on the coast of Brittany? For one, it took some 5 years to get the study. Now that I've got the study, other than putting it into some library somewhere, what good did the study do?
Well, I don't think that I can address that. I can ask Dr. Ehler, but let me respond to one other aspect of what you're saying, is that You say that the Amoco Cadiz was a massive oil spill. It was minor compared with what we're dealing with here today, sir.
It was minor. So if you took 5 years for that one, how long are you going to take for this one?
Just in order to be able to do assessments on the effect on salmon, we're going to be able to have to be looking 5 years downstream, because some of these species won't come back as spawners for at least 5 years. So if there are other long-term toxic effects that we don't know, we could be another 5 years beyond that.
What about it, Dr. Ela? You agree with that assessment?
Well, certainly there are many things that will be done in the short run and are being done right now. In fact, to complete a long-term assessment of some of these damages, it will take us anywhere between 3 to 5 years to see some of the longer-term effects. Many short-run effects, the lethal effects, are very visible right now. We're measuring those and we're documenting those. Some of the science will take longer.
And then what do we do after we document it all? You said you had 15 years experience. I'm getting to the practical and realistic result. I've done all the studying and I've got it all documented, and has that led to any kind of legislation, change of policy, better practices, or what, after your 15-year experience, Argo merchants, the Cadiz, and all the rest of them, what have we learned?
Well, I would say the immediate purpose of doing the measurements of environmental effects is to be used in the damage assessment, which means putting economic values on those effects so that we can in fact file claims to recover some of those damages. That's the immediate purpose of doing science in the field right now and doing it in a timely way.
And what's the responsibility of NOAA or the government to file claims once the assessment is made? Dr. Evans, you want to?
Once we've made the assessment, for all practical purposes, what we will do is we'll present a bill to Exxon for what the cost of the damages are.
Is there any limit to that bill that you're going to give Exxon under the statute?
No, sir, not that I know of. Is there a limit to the amount that...
Under the Clean Water Act, if willful negligence is shown, then there is no limitation to their liability. However, absent willful negligence, there is approximately an $8 million cap under the way the statute is currently written.
You go try the case in Alaska?
Oh, no. We'll leave that to the Justice Department, sir.
Well...
Your Honor, we're working in concert with the other trustees and with the Department of Justice in an effort to put together a damage assessment that put a value on the resources that are lost and attempt to identify how best to restore those resources as closely as is possible.
Dr. Evans, why do you say the Amoco Cadiz was minor compared to this one?
Well, I think, let me refer back to some of the material in my testimony, Mr. Chairman. This is a very, very special part of the world. It's a fjord. It's a very steep bottom area. The winds can come up very rapidly, as we saw in the one day, 50-mile-an-hour winds. It can be flat calm the next day. We have high tides moving in and out of the area, 15-foot, 20-foot tides. It's a difference between having something in a bottle. I think if you're looking at the difference between a quarter-pound piece of dynamite is one thing if you throw it out in the middle of a field and let it blow up, where it has a lot of place for that energy to spread to. But if you do it in an enclosed area, it enhances the impact of it. And I think that's what we have here, is that the oil is moved around with all of the little cubby holes and various things that we have in the total shoreline in this area. There are going to be places where we are having potential effect on fisheries and others that we may not even discover for at least the next couple of years.
What's the potential effect, if any, on others' shores? As I understand, the current goes north, cuts across the Arctic and North Pacific, and could this reach Russia?
No, I don't believe so. The direction it's going right now is it's going on up the Kenai Peninsula, headed towards, as Senator Stevens said, towards Kodiak Island. There will probably be, based on what current it gets into, we could have tar balls washing up on beaches all the way down to British Columbia. But we understand the direction, although the accuracy of our forecasting of the direction of this based on wind and currents is best is we can give you about 24-hour for the trajectory. I think on an overall basis, we can have a pretty good idea of where we're going to see things wash up. At this stage, I think it's pretty well tied to what the major current and wind systems are and where it's going to be pushed. But as far as what we're concerned about right now is the immediate effects that it's going to have in other places in Alaska. Kodiak, as Senator Stevens says, is a very, very large area as far as fisheries go. We have some concerns, at least I have some concerns because of my fisheries background, is that if this gets to Shelikof Straits, we have a problem there, and that the pollock, which is a multi-billion-dollar resource, is beginning to spawn. And we don't really know what the effect or the impact of this is going to be on that. So that's, that's a little scary. But that is a possibility, and we are tracking it very closely. I don't know, Bud, you know, do you have any idea of what direction it's going to go past Kenai, or is that too far downstairs?
Generally going westerly.
Generally going westerly, sir.
Very good. Mr. Robinson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'll talk a little bit about...
See if you can move that microphone a little bit closer. Thank you.
I'll talk about the wildlife, the impact on the wildlife resources of that area. With me today, or at least available in the audience, is John Martin, who is our manager of the Alaskan Maritime Refuge, elements of which have been impacted by this spill. The oil spill has had adverse and often fatal impacts on many species of wildlife in Prince William Sound. Fish and Wildlife Service has management authority over migratory birds and sea otters, while the National Marine Fisheries Service has authority over other marine mammals and the fishery resources of that area. None of the bird species or the Alaskan population of sea otters, I should add, are listed under the Endangered Species Act. The scale of the spill impact is just now starting to become clear to us. Our preliminary beach surveys have found 80 oiled birds per 100 meters of beach on the islands in the path of the spill, and it's highly unlikely that most of those oil birds can be recovered and cleaned, although we're making every effort to do so. We anticipate that 3,000 to 5,000 seabirds could be recovered and cleaned. Absent their being recovered and cleaned, a high percentage of the birds that become heavily oiled will simply not survive. We do not at this time have any estimates of the likely number of birds that may be killed by the spill, and I think in the next couple of weeks we'll get better numbers on that figure. Eagles have been observed, bald eagles have been observed scavenging oil-killed birds. Although no dead eagles have been found, the service believes that toxicity connected to oil-soaked birds could kill bald eagles. And there are approximately 750 bald eagles resident in the Prince William Sound area. An aerial survey conducted after the spill counted 90,000 birds, half of which were in the area impacted by the spill. Aerial surveys are not expected to produce accurate total population counts, since many birds and animals simply can't be seen in the oil. During this time of year, there is generally accepted figure of about 350,000 bird residents in Prince William Sound. As Dr. Evans has mentioned, those migratory birds are coming in as we speak, and we'll add another 100,000 to that population. In addition, over 100,000 birds nest in the Chiswell Islands, and it's an element of the Maritime Refuge to the southwest of the Sound, and the first strings of oil have already reached those islands. The total sea otter population of the Sound is estimated at 10 to 12,000, and the heaviest concentration, about half of those, is located in the southeastern part of the Sound, and this represents the highest concentration of sea otters. The population has not been affected. That population in the eastern area has not been affected by the spill as of yet. Approximately half the otter population in the Sound is likely to be impacted by the spill. If the spill should change directions, of course, and goes into the southeastern area, the situation would worsen dramatically for the otter. Fish and Wildlife Service presently has 24 people committed to monitoring, cleanup, and bird and otter rescue activities. We have 2 chartered boats and 16 people working to locate oiled otters and bring them to the sea otter cleaning facility operated by Exxon in Valdez. We're operating constant aerial surveys of the sound to monitor the movement of oil and its relationship to the seabird and otter population. And these aircraft are also on the alert for oiled otters and then tell the ships in the area where the otters are for capture. Under current wind and tide forecast, the leading edge of the spill, as we said before, could reach Kodiak Islands this weekend. Service personnel and others from the National Response Team are identifying and prioritizing those areas that could be protected in the islands. 2 service vessels are being moved into the area to support damage. It will consist primarily of surveys, bird surveys, mammal surveys, sea otters, to determine how many of those critters have been affected and how many have been affected adversely. An assessment of the natural resource damages under the provisions of the Comprehensive Environmental Response Act is being initiated. That's what our people are doing now. In the process of picking up the oiled and injured wildlife, they're also making counts to use in the future to gain compensation. That concludes my prepared statements, Mr. Chairman. I'd be glad to try to answer any questions you might have.
Senator Stevens.
Chairman, on April 4th, I received a prediction of the trajectory of the Exxon Valdez Prince William Sound oil spill from Dr. Royer. I've sent it to the various teams that are working on this, but I think it's very important to examine what he says. It'll take a couple of minutes to read it, but I think it's timely with these witnesses here. Dr. Royer says the oil spill in Prince William Sound will exit the sound through Montague Strait and follow the coast to the west-southwest. It enters the Alaska coastal current, a relatively swift, low salinity flow that is driven by freshwater runoff and winds. The current is usually 5 to 10 miles wide, with surface currents of about 0.75 knots, plus or minus 0.2 of a knot at this time of year. It might best be thought of as a river running along the coast. The oil should remain in this flow in a very coherent manner with little spreading across the shelf. The entrance of the oil into local bays will depend on local winds, with offshore winds, of course, favoring no transport onshore. Easterly winds will accelerate the alongshore transport of the oil and will cause the oil to wash up on the exposed beaches. The oil patch or patches should be at the mouth of the Cook Inlet within 6 days. Mind you, that's April 4th he was talking. In 6 to 10 days. It will probably be a series of patches extending from Prince William Sound to Cook Inlet. Once again, the amount of oil entering the inlet will be dependent upon the local winds at the time of arrival, but roughly half of the oil at the entrance will enter. The remainder will travel southward along the westward shore of Kodiak Island. Here the coastal current becomes less intense and cross-shelf mixing of the oil will take place. There's some unknown fraction of oil entering Cook Inlet and on the shelf off Kodiak will continue down the Aleutian Island chain. Here the coastal current is not as intense, but is a broad diffuse flow filling the shelf rather than the narrow coastal flow as it is along the northern Gulf of Alaska. Some unknown portion of the oil, whatever portion remains in the water column, should begin to go through Unumak Pass sometime in June or July. That's the pass that the Bristol Bay fish run goes through in the Bristol Bay. The upper water layers of the Prince William Sound region should be flushed in several weeks, though the deep waters, I repeat this, the deep waters might not be flushed until fall, when the deep water renewal takes place. The coastal flow increases in the fall up to 3.5 knots due to the annual precipitation cycle, and this should rapidly transport the oil out of the sound to the west in the fall. His predictions then, interpreting them, means that the oil should be in Cook Inlet but sometime between April 10th and 16th, should arrive at Kodiak sometime between April 14 and 21, and it will be in June sometime in Unumak Pass sometime in June, with the possibility of a renewal of all of this when the oil that's gone into the deep water column is disgorged from the sound due to the fall runoff, which is intense. If you've ever seen that precipitation cycle, it's intense in the September-October area. Now, gentlemen, what do you think should be done with regard to the areas beyond the damage to date? I mean, we haven't had damage yet in Cook Inlet. We haven't had any damage yet in Kodiak. We haven't any damage along the Aleutian coast, Aleutian Island chain coast. And particularly, we haven't had any damage in Unimak Pass yet. Have any of you any knowledge of any attempts anywhere in the world to try and change the flow of this oil as it streaks out in these long tendrils we saw of oil being wind-driven and current-driven up there?
Senator Stevens, no, I'm not aware of any. One of the things that we were very interested in was the information that you presented from Dr. Royer, and in fact, we were not familiar with that, but we are going to check with him. We certainly are very interested in any of the information he has. One of the things we have been doing is that our models, interestingly enough, seem to agree very closely with the description that you just gave, and one of the things that we've been doing is trying to get our teams, in fact, some of our members or some of the team that you were mentioning about, some of the people are getting out ahead of some of these, and we're using this in order to make samples and make tests in the area for the damage assessment. I know that doesn't mitigate what the oil is going to do in that area, but I think that there are people that have been placed in Seward and other places to try to put booms up in various areas and to do whatever we possibly can to try to see if we can keep it out of the sensitive areas. But other than that, I just think we're not experienced in mitigating it.
Well, the thing that bothers me about the current control of the actions to be taken to prevent further harm is that they're all related to damage control. They're not related to prevention. Some of them are, I guess, and the booms are a preventative concept. But for instance, I was told in one area that hay had been dropped on the beaches from the air before the oil hit those beaches, and as the oil came in, it hit the hay, and the hay was raked up or cleaned up and burned later. I asked if that was being considered for Alaska, and I was told no. Then I asked about the use of a drift net, whether anyone had thought of putting one of the 40-mile drift nets out there and sling it across this current and weight it down pretty heavily and try to put in absorbable booms behind it and let it see if it can pick up some of this slick as it moves towards Kodiak and remove the booms as they get oil soaked and put new ones in. And I was told, no, that's never been tried, and we're not going to experiment. Now, are you gentlemen going to experiment at all when this gets out in these open areas that are certainly beyond the Prince William Sound now, beyond the capability of anybody that I know of so far to come up with some suggestion? Is there going to be any experimentation at all?
Let me refer to Dr. Ehler because he's much more familiar with the programs that they're doing, but I'm not aware of any experimentation, but I certainly would be in favor of it if it would increase our knowledge in any way of how to deal with this thing. This is, so that, I don't know, we may have some programs going, but let Dr. Ehler address that.
Well, I think those alternatives that Senator Stevens identified, to my knowledge, are certainly not being tried now. On the other hand, there are teams of people up there, as you know, who are running over virtually every possibility of mitigating the effects of this particular spill. I just don't have the information about what is being considered right now, but I would suspect that all of those kinds of alternatives have been run over in some detail. Evaluated.
Sure. I monitored, Dr. Ehler, the Bantry Bay in Ireland. It was a refinery spill, and that straw protective procedure to protect the beaches was used there, and very successfully.
That's what I was told. And I was told instantly, we had no market for hay this year, so it's all up there. No one's even asked. And that the drift nets that you're responsible now for bringing in the drift nets on the legislation this committee started. Several of them have been brought in. They're piled up somewhere. No one's even thought about trying to sling them out there and have them do some good. They're very harmful, as we all know, to fish. But we could try. Mr. Chairman, there's been a complete unwillingness to try to experiment because of some reason. Somebody says if they try and it doesn't succeed, who's going to pay the bill? And secondly, will it increase the damages to Exxon, or will they object? That's why we want the Coast Guard in control up there. I can't understand. But even then, you know, I don't think the Coast Guard really is thinking in terms of experimentation yet. I got to tell you, I would wish we could get a plane and fly this whole committee up there and let them see what's going to happen to Kodiak. I think if anybody went up as I did and see what I saw, they'd come back as mad as I am. And I'm mad because no one's thinking of trying to stop this thing. Now, Bill, you guys have got good brains and you know, the whole group that's involved here. I know you all. Steve, you people know this area just like I know it, and there's no reason to accept the inevitable, being that this is going to destroy Kodiak fisheries, it's going to go down the chain, and it's going to go through the pass into the Bristol Bay salmon run. That is unacceptable. We've got to try. Even if you fail, you got to try. And I don't know how to get you going. Is it money? I was told yesterday that all you need to do is ask Exxon, and within foreseeable, you know, limits you couldn't dream of, money's available. They know they've got horrendous liability if this gets to Kodiak. Just horrendous. You can name them off, the things that are over there, Bill. King crab, scallops, the whole New Bedford fleet's over there now. Yeah. A sole, half of our sole now is coming out of the North Pacific. You name it, bottom fish, the home of the bottom fish in Shelikof Strait. You closed it once because it was so sensitive to the problems that we're developing there. Now, I think we could safely say that this is the largest producing area for fisheries in the world today that was healthy until March 24th. And people seem to just accept the inevitable, that it's going to, we just can't stop it. Somehow or other, we've got to get an attitude that we're going to try to stop it. I would hope that you'd help us get some control. These sea fences, for instance, I heard about. Have you ever heard of the sea fences?
Yes, sir. I heard this morning, I was here when they were talking about that's a 42-inch boom.
Well, I'm told that Norway has them on stock. They're the ones that they stock them as a matter of national preparedness. They're stocked over there, and they offer to send some over here. I'd have 2 C5As on the way this afternoon if you can find them, and try them.
What about Dr. Ely? He's the expert on hazardous materials. Isn't there something more that we can be doing from your point of expertise? It seems like there could be some more preventive measures being taken.
I think there's always more that can be done. I think that the point that has to be made is that there's tremendous uncertainty about what is actually going to happen and where this oil is going to go and where it's going to wind up. Nothing is inevitable. There's a great deal of unknowns with respect to where this spill is moving, where in the water column it will be, what effects it will have on living resources in this area and in the areas further west.
But just like everybody's got to be somewhere, and this oil is going to be somewhere for at least the next 4 or 5 months. You agree with that?
Absolutely, and it will be there longer than that.
And trying to do something about it.
No question about that. I think there are a lot of people on the scene who are trying to do something about containing that oil in the first place, following and predicting where it's going to go, and minimizing the effects that it has.
Well, do you know of anybody who's attempted to change the direction of it in terms of the open spill as it's moving down the Alaska coastal current, coming out of Montague Straits and going into the Gulf?
No, there is no one to my knowledge doing.
I don't know if anyone's even attempted, even experimented to try and change that flow.
Again, I agree. There is no one.
Now they've done a good job of trying to boom off specific areas. Your people have done a real good job working with that instant response team and what they've tried to do in terms of protecting Resurrection Creek, protecting the Kenai Fjords National Park, and and now moving in to protect the Homer area. The team, I understand, is moving over now. I hope you do move it over there. They want to go over there. And then we're looking even further to Kodiak. But all that's on the basis of how do we protect the beaches when it gets there. I don't know. Maybe we ought to take all the airboats from Frank Murkowski's part of the state and turn them around and let them blow that oil south. Maybe people would be a little bit more worried about it if it was going south. They're not too worried about it when it's going north. Now, that's the problem, and it's going towards the greatest salmon run, the greatest fishery run in the world today. Probably, you've been up there. Now, here's a salmon fisherman.
Yeah, it's not going to ruin Clark's Point there at Catch Can.
No, it can't get down there.
Well, we can end this hearing. Well, the hour is late. You gentlemen have been very obliging. The record will stay open for questions by the committee here. We appreciate the testimony here now, and I hope you appreciate the concern that we do have, and we'll be working with you, and don't let the budget hold you up. I want to know about that immediately. I want to thank Senator Murkowski for sticking with us, as well as Senator Stevens. The committee will be in recess to the call of the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
30 years ago, on March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker struck a reef in Alaska's Prince William Sound and spilled close to 11 million gallons of crude oil. George H.W. Bush was president at the time. He and several cabinet members held a briefing about 2 weeks after the spill to give an update on the government's response. Taking questions from reporters are Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, Transportation Secretary Samuel Skinner, and EPA Administrator William Riley. This portion is about 25 minutes.
I have a statement and then be glad to take a few questions and then refer them to our experts here. But virtually every American is familiar with the tragic environmental disaster in Alaskan waters. And more than 10 million gallons of oil have been spilled, with deadly results for wildlife and hardship for local citizens. We all share the sorrow and concern of Alaskans and a determination to mount a sustained cleanup effort. Our ultimate goal must be the complete restoration of the ecology and the economy of Prince William Sound, including all of its fish, marine mammals, birds, and other wildlife. The Exxon Corporation has acknowledged responsibility for this spill and its liability for the damages. Exxon should remain responsible for both damages and for employing civilian personnel necessary to control further damage. However, Exxon's efforts, standing alone, are not enough. And after consulting with the Congressional delegation, Senator Ted Stevens, Senator Frank Murkowski, Congressman Don Young, I have determined to add additional federal resources to the cleanup effort, in addition to the considerable federal personnel and equipment already on the scene. And this new effort will focus on the job of helping recover oil now in the water and restoring beaches and other damaged areas. This effort should not in any way relieve Exxon from any of its responsibilities or its liabilities. I've asked Sam Skinner, our Secretary of Transportation, to serve as the coordinator of the efforts of all federal agencies involved in the cleanup and to work with the Alaskan authorities and Exxon. Admiral Paul Yost, the Commandant of the Coast Guard, will return to Alaska to assume the personal oversight of developments. As we all know, the Coast Guard has many assets in place right now. Also at my direction, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney will make available U.S. Armed Forces personnel and equipment to assist in the cleanup. The military will provide personnel for direct cleanup activities, as well as assisting with logistics, the needs of logistics related to the cleanup. And of course, these efforts must be undertaken carefully so that further damage to fragile areas will not occur. Intensive planning now going on, as well as appropriate cleanup training, will be completed before ground units are actually deployed. In addition to the Department of Defense personnel, I've asked my staff to develop plans to enable volunteers to participate in cleanup activities. By summer, we hope to have developed facilities to enable us to accommodate a corps of Alaskan volunteers. And when I say develop facilities, as these gentlemen will tell you, we're dealing with very remote areas in some cases here. I've asked EPA Administrator Bill Riley to coordinate the long-range planning to restore the environment of the Sound. EPA will draw on the expert of leading scientists and oil spill experts in this work, and it will also consult with other federal agencies that are assessing scientific data regarding the effects of the spill. We will not forget the residents of Alaska who have suffered extraordinary economic loss. And when you talk to these congressmen, as I have, and get it brought home on case-by-case basis, we have to be concerned, and we are concerned. In addition to paying damage claims against it, we encourage Exxon to increase its local hiring for the cleanup efforts. Secretary Skinner will also work with Exxon and appropriate agencies to develop appropriate loan assistance programs to assist those who have suffered economic injury. This situation has demonstrated the inadequacy of existing contingency plans, and consequently, I have directed a nationwide review of contingency plans of this type to determine improvements that may be necessary. In describing these measures, we should not be under any illusions. The job of cleaning up the oil from both the sea and the affected land areas will be massive, prolonged, and frustrating. Nothing we can do will totally resolve this problem in the short term. Rather, we must be prepared for a long, sustained effort. Learning from this experience, we also rededicate ourselves to transportation safety and to realistic planning for accidents that do occur. At the same time, our national security interest in the domestic energy supplies should not be forgotten. The excellent safety record that was recorded prior to this incident must be restored and maintained consistently into the future. I really do have to run, and I'll just turn this over now to Sam Skinner, and I know they'll, and the congressmen and senators.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Not at all. Well, good luck, and I hope we can.
Much, Mr. President.
We want to help, and we care about what's happening up there in Alaska.
John.
All right.
I'm gonna be real short.
Deflect a few shots.
Well, we have already begun immediately to implement the President's program. We've met with the Department of Defense Resources, which Secretary Cheney will talk about in a minute. We have already met with the Exxon people, and we'll be meeting with them again this afternoon. We're at full scale. We're moving full scale ahead on the President's directive, and we are totally committed to do everything we can to restore the Alaskan area around Prince William Sound and any other areas that are affected to as close as to nature as possible. I think Secretary Cheney and then Bill Riley would like to say something.
I'll be very brief. Obviously, our role at the Pentagon in this effort is a supporting one. I think it's important people realize that we have been actively involved already. We've had a large number of flights into the area, the C-5As and C-141s to move equipment. There'll be a team leaving today to see what additional support and assistance we can provide. All of this will be under command of General McInerney, who's a three-star Air Force general who's on the scene up there in Alaska on a regular basis as well. The kinds of things we think we can be helpful in is to establish control and coordinate activities in the area. We plan to send a command and control platform to Valdez. Valdez, of course, is the main community up there, but there's very little housing available to move people into the area. So we think we can dispatch amphibious ships into the region to be used to house, feed, and provide comfort for those who are involved in the cleanup effort. We will establish an on-the-scene task force in Valdez and see what we can do additionally in terms of building up transportation resources. My mandate from the President is to do whatever I can to be helpful and supportive, and certainly I'll do my best.
Mr. Riley.
Well, as you know, the environment of Prince William Sound is an extraordinarily rich one in terms of sea life, in terms of bird life, in terms of sea mammals and commercial fisheries. We want to restore it to what it has been. It has obviously suffered a very serious blow. We have no way of knowing or assessing at this time how enduring the impact will be. The President has directed that I coordinate the planning for the recovery, the restoration of the ecology of the Sound. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is undertaking the ecological assessment. It will probably be some time, several months, before we have even a preliminary idea of what we're looking at here. The overall NOAA assessment will take about 3 years. One of my first jobs is going to be to bring to bear on this problem a group of scientists. We are looking around the world for the very best scientific resources that are available, people who have dealt with significant oil spills before, and we want to bring that expertise to bear on this problem.
Questions?
Can you clarify something on cost? What is the President saying about liability? Has Exxon agreed already to reimburse you, or will you have to go to court to seek reimbursement?
Well, first of all, Exxon is pouring millions of dollars a day into Alaska right now in support of the effort coordinated by the Coast Guard. I'm meeting with them this afternoon to discuss the costs related to this additional effort. In addition, at the request of the senators and the congressmen from Alaska, we've begun to explore with Exxon as well as the federal government other possibilities to make economic loans or small or low no-interest loans available to the people that may be injured as a result of their disaster there. So this effort is a coordinated effort. I can't give you a precise answer on dollars. That's part of the assessment that's ongoing. I think it's important to recognize the President is committed to restoring that area as close as we can to its original condition, and the resources of the United States government have been put at my disposal to make sure that happens, and I plan to use them.
I ask Commandant Yost the question. The last time you were here, you stated that you found it almost unbelievable, to quote you, that this tanker could have run aground, given that it was going through a 10-mile wide area. Are you satisfied that the alleged intoxication of the captain sufficiently accounts for this accident and the other circumstances?
Well, as you know, almost moments after the vessel went aground, I asked the National Transportation Safety Board to investigate this marine casualty. That's a job that the Coast Guard would normally have done, but because the Coast Guard had a vessel traffic service in the area, I asked the National Transportation Safety Board to do it. They are doing it. They're doing a craftsman-like job. When we get the results of that investigation, we'll know a lot more than we know now. And that's all that I could tell you on that issue.
Could you give us numbers on...
Let me try to, you can ask whoever you want, but let's try to coordinate this or we'll have everybody. Secretary Cheney, I noticed there's a couple questions for him.
Can you tell us what the President meant when he said that military personnel would be involved in the actual cleanup itself?
Well, they'll be involved clearly in terms of providing transportation support, providing housing, in terms of trying to move in amphibious ships to the area. One of the things we need to do is to improve the operations of Valdez Airport, for example. It's not a 24-hour airport now. We've got the capacity, I think, to go in and help solve that problem. And it may involve as well the direct involvement of U.S. military personnel in the cleanup, just as they were involved previously, for example, in fighting the forest fires in Yellowstone last year. I don't know enough yet this morning to be able to say to you these are the specific tasks that they will perform, but we'll do our best to help.
Which military branch? Who specifically?
Well, at this point, nearly everybody's involved. Obviously, Admiral Yost is in effect the on-the-scene head of the operation. General McInerney, that I mentioned before, is chairman of the Joint Task Force in Alaska. who will be in the area in immediate control. The Army will be involved. The Director of Military Support here in Washington at the Pentagon, General Smith, will be involved in coordinating the response of the Department to the extent additional support is needed there. It's a unique, obviously, incident in Alaska in terms of the environmental disaster that's occurred, but this kind of military support to deal with a domestic problem has oftentimes occurred before. I've got a long list of examples if anybody's interested, and that's basically what we'll do now.
Secretary Cheney, how many people are you talking about? Are you talking about thousands?
I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer to that today.
Can you tell me who is now in control of the cleanup? Who's in charge? Is it Exxon or the federal government?
Well, I'll turn that over to the Sam Skinner. There you go, Sam.
As you know, as the President indicated to you, one of the major objectives was to offload the tanker that had 40 million gallons of fuel. That's now been done. As a result of that offloading operation and as a result of conversations that we've had in the last 2 days, the Coast Guard has taken a greater role in the overall cleanup. They will obviously, as a result of the President's mandate today, have even a more significant role. Admiral Yost and Vice Admiral Robbins will be going to Alaska in the not-too-near future again to make sure that effort is coordinated. But the answer to your question is the Coast Guard is the overall coordinator. There is one head. It's the Commandant of the Coast Guard and his designates. Exxon, the state of Alaska, the other military organizations will be supporting him within their own command structures.
Skinner, you Coastline is directing the federal government should take over at least part of this, and you said federalization beyond Prince William Sound. Are you satisfied now with the President's decisions on this?
I'm satisfied that the President has come forward and given us a considerable portion of the requests that we've made to him and his staff, and the cabinet people are here. I still have great concern over the oil that's still going out of Prince William Sound, heading now towards Kodiak. And Admiral Yost is a man that we have absolute confidence in. We're pleased to see that he will be coordinating this effort now. We have never asked for federalization. We've asked for federal control of the further actions that must be taken to try and deal. We feel there's at least 2 million gallons still going out of the Sound towards Kodiak, and we must try to do something about that. But beyond that, I don't know if you know the extent to which Secretary Cheney's already been involved. He's got 100 naval officers up working for Paul Yost now, not officers, naval personnel. They've got 22 skimmers up there. That's probably, I imagine, 3/4 of the Navy's skimmer fleet that's up there now. We've had a tremendous increase in effort in the last 3 days, and we are pleased to see this increased effort. We still have a request that there be an emergency declared under the Stafford Act. The Department of Justice, as I understand, has reservations about that, and we're pursuing that. And we still have the question, the overall question of who's going to be in control of the review of these contingency plans, and I'm discussing that with Mr. Riley, and I believe it'll be worked out. But yes, from yesterday to today, I'd say it's the difference between night and day as far as the federal presence in regard to dealing with this massive continuing disaster. The earthquake lasted 4 minutes. This is going to last years. And I think everybody better realize it's going to last years in terms of the recovery.
Secretary Skinner.
Ellen, and then back to you, Brett. Ellen, and then...
Secretary Skinner, about a week ago, you and your colleagues stood here and said Exxon was doing a decent job, all speed ahead, and so forth. What's happened in the last week? Did they blow it? What's going on?
No. What's happened is that we've now offloaded the vessel, and we now have had the flow, and we've seen the flow of fuel and oil out it further than we've not anticipated, but it's moved down further, so this effort has to change. We now are beginning, however, to address the long-range cleanup of the islands and land that has been damaged. This is something that Senator Stevens pointed out will go on for months. And this effort now is beginning. It wasn't appropriate to begin it at that time because all the resources were dedicated towards containing and getting the oil off the tanker. We're now moving to a new phase. That new phase is to begin the cleanup of the islands that have been affected. That's the effort that the Department of Defense is going to help support, along with the Coast Guard, the citizens of Alaska, and other people. The President wants as personally indicated, he wants a civilian involvement, maybe a youth involvement this spring and summer, but this effort's going to go on. So what's changed is the mission has changed because we've gotten through one phase, we're moving into another phase.
Yes, Brad, I told you. The fact that the Commandant of the Coast Guard is now said by you to be the overall head of the effort and in light of the greatly enlarged federal presence here, why do you resist saying that this effort has been federalized? It plainly has, hasn't it?
Well, it has been a significant increase. The word federalization is a word of art that may have statutory connotations. The important thing to recognize is that there is a significant increase in federal effort, and we avoid the use of the word federalized because of some legal connotations. I might add on that issue, I spoke with Governor Cooper last night. Governor Cooper indicated to me that he is for more coordination and more support along the lines that we've indicated. He did not ask for federalization. His letter was inaccurate in that request. So if you have been reporting he asked for federalization, he is not asking for federalization.
Secretary Stewart?
Well, yes, sir. And then
what is your position on liability? Is Exxon liable for returning the environment to near pristine condition, and will Exxon be asked to foot part of the bill for the federal effort that you're
Oh, yes. Exxon has already been spending millions of dollars a day. We are talking about additional support from Exxon, and Administrator Riley has been discussing with them the efforts that need to be made to restore the environment. So, number one, they're liable. They've acknowledged liability. They are working with us in putting funds available to restore, to recover, and to repair, and all of that is going on a concerted basis with the Coast Guard.
Let me follow up. When you were here last week, I guess, Mr. Riley said he mentioned to Exxon that they should take on the added responsibility of cleaning up the beaches and doing the extra work to get it to a more natural state. And they said it was, as I recall, their response to you was that it was an interesting idea.
No, the question...
You broached at that meeting.
What I suggested that you're referring to was that they consider establishing a fund for Alaskan conservation that would go well beyond this immediate period and provide monies for future ecological restoration efforts. That is a different matter from the cleanup itself, in which they've invested, I think there's something like 350 or so people currently working on beach cleanup that are working for Exxon. We feel that's not enough. We think that the size of this disaster, the very large scale in which we're operating in Prince William Sound, is going to require a lot more people and an intensified effort, and that's what we intend to see happen now.
Mr. Riley, on this review of contingency plans, let me ask you specifically what steps you intend to take to review the plans, and in a broader context, the review that is already underway looking at the feasibility of drilling off the California coast. What specific steps are you going to take in light of this?
Well, those are two different issues. The National Response Team is now beginning to look at contingency plans for oil spills really around this country. I think given what we have learned here about the obvious inadequacy of the plan that existed for Prince William Sound, that's a reasonable, prudent, very urgently needed step. The task force that includes Secretary Lujan, myself, Secretary Watkins, and the National Academy of Sciences is looking at the feasibility of protecting the environment adequately, of ensuring that we can, in fact, go forward with those 2 leasehold sales off the coast of California and Florida, and we will do that.
You're going to take from this event to the review of the leaseholds off of California and Florida? What are the lessons that you're going to take to the review of...
Well, I think that that effort already had a very strong expression of presidential concern. The administration, after all, is foregoing almost $500 million in revenues from the sale of those leases this year. We are we're giving every bit of attention we could to making sure that that extremely important environment, those very sensitive areas, were protected, and if they could not be adequately protected, we will not go forward with those sales.
Let's take this final question.
Let me, yeah.
Am I to understand that you have no idea how many people it's going to take, how long it's going to take, and how much it's going to cost?
We have the Special Operations Group of the Department of Defense met yesterday and is meeting today with the Coast Guard. We're going to assess what realistic support is necessary. We have a pledge from the President and the Secretary of Defense to have that support made available. So we do not have, well, clearly there will be a significant increase in the effort. To quantify it at this point until the Department of Defense Coast Guard assessment team has been on the scene and has come back to us would be, in my opinion, ill-advised. So we will be making that assessment. We will be putting the program together, and once we've got it together in the not-too-distant future, within days, we'll be back to you. Time, we will, the important thing to recognize is, first of all, the team is on its way today. They'll be back. We'll have a complete program put together early next week. We will then begin to deploy it as it makes sense. We're not going to put people up there until they're equipped and trained and ready to do it. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, last question, I think.
I don't know what the federal statutes on this are, but in time of war, the Coast Guard comes under DOD. Is this such a national emergency that you even discuss the possibility of the Coast Guard coming under DOD?
No, this is a major civilian disaster. It is being treated as such by the President. It is not a national military disaster that would call for federalization of the Coast Guard. Thank you.
Hey, Bill.